Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going underground. Not in a dramatic way, don't worry, more in a quiet, spiraling, stone staircase kind of way. We're descending into the Stepwells of India. Imagine this, the sun is blazing overhead, hot enough that the air feels heavy. The fields are dry, the dust kicks up at every step, and the heat presses on your skin like a heavy blanket. And then, you reach a carved opening in the earth. You step down. One step, then another, then another. Slowly the light dims, the air cools, and the sound of the world above fades into silence. At the bottom, there's water. Shimmering, still, waiting. Around you, carved walls, pillars, and arches. You're in a stepwell, part reservoir, part temple, part refuge. Tonight, we're going to wander through these strange, beautiful spaces, half engineering project, half meditation chamber, and see how they shaped daily life, faith, and dynasties for centuries. Stepwells, or Baolis and Vavs depending on the region, are essentially giant staircases leading down to water. Simple in theory, but in practice, they became some of the most elaborate and haunting structures in India. At their heart, they were practical, ways to access groundwater in regions where rivers dried up and monsoons came and went with frustrating irregularity. But practicality in India rarely stays practical. It tends to grow temples, carvings, and layers of symbolism until you can't tell if you're fetching water or stepping into another world. The earliest stepwells date back to around 600 CE, though some argue there were simpler versions even earlier. By the medieval period, especially under the Solanki rulers in Gujarat, they reached their most elaborate form. Imagine not just stairs and water, but entire underground palaces, 5, 6, 7 stories deep, carved with pillars, shrines, and geometric patterns. A simple water tank turned into a cathedral of stone. One of the most famous is Rani Ki Vav, the Queen's Stepwell, in Patan, Gujarat. Built in the 11th century, supposedly commissioned by Queen Udayamati in memory of her husband, it descends 7 levels, each lined with thousands of sculptures. Gods, goddesses, apsaras, celestial dancers, all carved into the sandstone walls. Walking down feels less like fetching a bucket of water and more like entering a silent theater where every statue is watching you. The irony, of course, is that while villagers came here daily with pots balanced on their heads, their bare feet slapping against the stone steps, they were doing something utterly ordinary. Fetching water, washing clothes, cooling off. Stepwells were places where the divine and the mundane sat side by side. You could pray to Vishnu on your way down, then splash your goats at the bottom. Sacred and sweaty, all at once. But let's pause for a second on the vibe of these places. Stepwells are eerie. From the surface, many just look like a hole in the ground with a modest opening. But descend inside, and suddenly it opens up into a vast, echoing, symmetrical space. Light filters down in shafts. The air grows cooler, damp, still. Voices bounce off the carved walls. Footsteps echo. The deeper you go, the less the outside world matters. By the time you reach the water, you're in a twilight world, cut off from heat, sound, and time. For medieval travelers, these must have felt like miracles. Imagine walking across a dry plain, parched, exhausted, and stumbling upon a stepwell. You descend, step by step, and at the bottom there's cool water, shade, and relief. The space wasn't just practical. It was psychological salvation. A reminder that someone, a king, a queen, a local noble, had thought far enough ahead to build this refuge. Speaking of nobles, stepwells were often vanity projects. Rulers built them to show off wealth, piety, and civic generosity. Commissioning a stepwell was considered a meritorious act, especially by queens and royal women. Which makes sense. You could build a fort, sure, but that just kept soldiers happy. A stepwell kept entire communities alive. And unlike palaces that might crumble, stepwells went on being useful for centuries. It was philanthropy with staying power. And sometimes, stepwells were about memory. Like Rani Ki Vav, built as a memorial. Water was sacred, life-giving, a bridge between worlds. So to build a stepwell in someone's honor wasn't just charity. It was eternal commemoration, etched in stone and rippling in water. Not all stepwells were grand, of course. Many were plain, functional pits with simple steps. Villages across Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh had small versions, where locals gathered daily. But even those carried a certain atmosphere. Water in India has always been more than water. Its ritual purity, its sacred presence, its connection to gods and ancestors. Even the humblest well had a touch of reverence. And let's be honest, they were also gossip centers. Fetching water was work usually done by women, and stepwells became places of conversation, laughter, complaints, whispered secrets. While kings imagined their stepwells as monuments of piety and power, ordinary villagers used them as chat rooms. Every splash of water carried news: who married whom, which harvest failed, which tax collector was being insufferable this week. But the architecture deserves a moment. The geometry is hypnotic. Descending layers of steps, often arranged in intricate patterns, zigzags, diagonals, converging lines that play tricks on the eyes. Some wells, like the famous Chand Baori in Rajasthan, have thousands of steps arranged in perfect symmetry, like a giant inverted pyramid. Looking down from above is dizzying, a geometric maze plunging into darkness. It's beautiful, unsettling, and oddly dreamlike. These patterns weren't accidental. They symbolized descent into the underworld, into sacred space, into the cosmic waters from which creation sprang. Every step downward was both practical and symbolic. You weren't just fetching water. You were reenacting a journey into the womb of the earth, into silence and mystery. So tonight, as we stand at the edge of one of these stepwells in our minds, let's linger. The sun is blazing overhead, the air is thick with heat. And then, the first step down. The stone is warm underfoot. Another step. The air cools. Voices echo faintly. Shadows lengthen. You keep descending, surrounded by carvings of gods, dancers, patterns etched in sandstone. The light dims to gold, then grey. And at the bottom, there's water. Cool, still, silent. You reach out your hand, touch it, feel the chill run up your arm. The noise of the world above has vanished. All that remains is stone, silence, and the endless ripple of water. So, we've looked at the stepwells as architecture, great inverted pyramids, carved into the earth, lined with gods and dancers, cooling air, and silence. But a building isn't just stone. It's the people who use it. And the stepwells of India weren't lonely ruins when they were built. They were alive, buzzing with voices, footsteps, and routines. Imagine the daily scene. Dawn breaks, and the village stirs. Women balance clay pots on their heads, laughing and chatting, heading toward the stepwell. The air is already warming, but the well is cool. They descend, step after step, their anklets jingling softly, bare feet echoing on stone. Children trail behind, playing, shouting, daring each other to splash in the sacred water. At the bottom, the women fill their pots, exchange gossip, maybe mutter a quick prayer to the goddess sculpted into the wall. Then they climb back up, pots balanced carefully, laughter floating behind them. The stepwell isn't just a water tank. It's a social hub. It's where you hear who's getting married, who quarreled with whom, which harvest is good, which tax collector is impossible. Kings and queens might have built them for prestige and piety, but everyday life made them something humbler, the village chat room, carved in stone. Stepwells were also places of ritual. Water has always been sacred in India. Rivers like the Ganges are worshipped. Tanks in temples are holy. Even the act of bathing can be a prayer. Stepwells absorbed that same energy. Shrines were carved into their walls, often dedicated to Vishnu, Shiva, or the mother goddess. A woman might descend not just for water but to light a lamp, offer flowers, or whisper a prayer for her family. Pilgrims might pause on their journeys to cleanse themselves before moving on. And sometimes, entire festivals centered around the wells. Seasonal rituals at the arrival of the monsoon, processions carrying offerings, songs sung in the echoing chambers. You can almost hear the voices rising in the stone corridors, mingling with the trickle of water. But stepwells weren't only spiritual. They were practical survival systems. In the desert regions of Gujarat and Rajasthan, water was life. During the blistering summers, rivers shrank to dust. Wells dried up. But stepwells, dug deep, tapped into groundwater reserves that lasted through droughts. They kept communities alive. Families could fetch drinking water, animals could drink, crops could survive. To lose a stepwell was to risk famine. That's why rulers invested in them. A king might build a fort to guard his throne, but a stepwell guarded his people's loyalty. When the rains failed, when the fields cracked, it was the stepwell that saved the village. People remembered who had built it. Dynastic propaganda was written not just in stone temples, but in cool, damp staircases leading to water. Of course, the atmosphere changed depending on the time of day. Morning was busy, women fetching water, children playing, priests stopping to pray. Afternoon might be quieter, the well becoming a place of rest for travelers. Imagine a trader walking through the dust, sweating under the sun, then descending into the cool shade of a step well. He sits, drinks deeply, and rests in silence before moving on. Evening brought other rhythms, fires lit at shrines, villagers gathering to cool themselves in the stone chambers, the air humming with conversation before sleep. And let's not ignore the human quirks. These places, despite their beauty, were also workplaces. People bickered. Children got scolded for splashing too much. Teenagers probably loitered longer than necessary, pretending to fetch water while hoping to glimpse a crush. Local guards had to keep order. Priests muttered about the proper rituals. Even the goats clambered down sometimes, bleating impatiently for a drink. The grandeur of the carvings may have suggested eternity, but daily life was always messy, ordinary, and human. Some wells were specifically tied to women. Commissioned by queens, maintained by communities of women, they became female-centered spaces in a patriarchal world. Inscriptions praise noble women for their piety in building stepwells, framing them as both religious and maternal acts. It wasn't just charity, it was a way to carve a woman's name into history, stone by stone, long after her palace quarters had been forgotten. Think of Udayamati and Rani Ki Vav, her name attached forever to one of the grandest stepwells in existence. The king she honored is mostly forgotten outside specialist history books. But her well, and her name, endure. A quiet victory in a world where queens were often sidelined. And then there was the quiet. Once the crowds had gone, once the pots were filled, the goats watered, the priests prayed, the stepwell fell into silence. A traveler descending alone might hear only the sound of dripping water, the creak of rope, the faint echo of footsteps. Some medieval poets compared stepwells to meditation chambers. Underground, with no horizon, no sun, no distraction, just stone, shadow, and water, it was easy to fall into thought. To lose yourself. To feel both sheltered and strangely small. So tonight, as we pause at the second level of one of these wells, let's picture it. The morning rush has ended. The steps are damp. The air smells faintly of moss and incense. Carvings of gods stare silently from the walls. A single woman descends, anklets jingling softly, her clay pot balanced on her hip. She kneels at the edge, dips the vessel into the water, watches the ripples spread. For a moment, the world above doesn't exist. This was daily life in the stepwells. Practical, sacred, gossip-filled, quiet, all woven together into stone and silence. So far, we've walked with villagers carrying pots, priests lighting lamps, and travelers pausing to rest. But now, let's stop looking at the people and just stare at the stone itself. Because stepwells weren't accidents. They were designed with as much care and symbolism as temples. Take a simple stepwell, a rectangular shaft with stairs leading down. Functional, yes. But by the medieval period, stepwells became elaborate architectural wonders. Builders used local sandstone or granite, carving shafts, corridors, and colonnades. Descending wasn't just vertical, it was spatial. You passed through pavilions, doorways, and levels, like walking into an underground palace. Some wells stretched 7 stories deep, each level supported by carved pillars. Arches framed your descent, narrowing the light until you felt swallowed by stone. From above, sunlight streamed down in shafts, illuminating carvings on the walls, flickering on the water below. It was half architecture, half illusion. And then there's the geometry. The patterns are hypnotic. In wells like Chand Baori in Rajasthan, thousands of steps zigzag in perfect triangles, creating a dizzying visual maze. Look down from above and it's like staring into a fractal. The steps seem endless, descending deeper and deeper, a staircase that feels like it might never stop. It's practical. More steps meant more access to water at different levels. But it's also strangely dreamlike. Some scholars suggest the geometry was symbolic, echoing ideas of cosmic order. Hindu architecture often aligns spaces with the universe, temples as mountains, tanks as oceans. A stepwell, with its descending symmetry, could be read as a journey into the primordial waters, the womb of creation. Each step downward mirrored a spiritual descent, each rise back upward a rebirth. Fetching water wasn't just survival. It was cosmology disguised as daily routine. And the carvings, oh, the carvings. Walk down into Rani ki Vav, and you're surrounded by gods and goddesses. Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent. Shiva with his trident. Parvati, Lakshmi, Ganesha, Apsaras, celestial dancers, frozen mid-movement, eternally gracing the stone corridors. Some sculptures are playful, some solemn, some almost mischievous. Together, they transform the well into a temple. But here's the irony. While villagers came here to haul water, they also brushed against divinity with every step. One hand balanced a clay pot, the other brushed past a carving of a god. Sacred and mundane, always side by side. You could literally bump your elbow against eternity while fetching your groceries. Stepwells also played with light. The deeper you went, the dimmer it grew, until at the bottom only a faint glow filtered down. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering with the reflection of water. Imagine descending at dusk, when the last rays of sun stretched down like golden fingers, catching statues' faces before vanishing. For medieval visitors, it must have felt otherworldly, stepping into a twilight realm where gods lived in shadow and silence. And then there's the sound. Stepwells amplified everything. A whisper bounced off the stone. A footstep echoed down the stairs. Water dripping echoed like a drum. Priests chanting at shrines sounded doubled, tripled, multiplied by the geometry. For those inside, the soundscape was as overwhelming as the visual one. Silence was never quite silent, always layered with echoes, always murmuring back at you. Symbolism wasn't just religious. Stepwells embodied political statements too. A king who built one wasn't just solving a water problem, he was staging a performance of power. Look how deep my engineers can dig. Look how many carvings I can pay sculptors to chisel. Look how my dynasty reaches from the sky to the underworld. The well was propaganda, carved in stone, filled with water, and impossible to ignore. Queens, too, found symbolism in them. When royal women commissioned stepwells, they were inscribing their own legacy into landscapes. A queen might never lead an army, but she could gift water to an entire city. In an arid climate, that was power. Quiet, maternal, but deeply political. And perhaps the most haunting symbolism, stepwells as thresholds. They sat between worlds, surface and underground, light and shadow, daily life and sacred space. In myths, water is often the boundary between realms, the place where gods dwell, where ancestors wait, where creation stirs. Descending a stepwell was, in a way, rehearsing that journey. You stepped out of the everyday and into a liminal space. You carried water back, but you also carried a brush with the sacred. Let's pause for a moment at one of these wells. Picture yourself on the uppermost step, sunlight blazing overhead. The village hums behind you, goats bleating, children shouting. You step down once, twice, 10 times. The noise softens. The air cools. Carved arches frame your view, shadows stretch. Gods stare at you from the walls, their stone eyes timeless. By the 3rd level, your footsteps echo. By the 5th, the light is gold and dim. And at the 7th, you reach the water, black, still, infinite. The surface mirrors your face, the carvings, the sky far above. For a moment, you feel suspended, neither above nor below. Just here, silent and small. That was the power of stepwell architecture. It wasn't just about water. It was about shaping how people felt, thought, and remembered. The geometry guided their steps. The carvings surrounded them with gods. The shadows reminded them of mystery. Even if you only came for a pot of water, you left with a memory of eternity. So far, we've descended into the steps, listened to the echoes, and admired the geometry. But wells don't carve themselves. Behind every stepwell was a patron, a king, a queen, or a noble family who decided that digging a giant staircase into the earth was the best way to spend their wealth. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Few monuments combine practicality and grandeur so neatly. Let's start with the Solanki dynasty of Gujarat, who ruled in the 11th and 12th centuries. These were the real patrons of stepwells at their peak. Gujarat is hot, dry, and unpredictable in its water supply. Building a step, well, there wasn't just generous, it was essential. So rulers poured resources into these projects, carving deeper, decorating more elaborately, turning necessity into spectacle. The most famous example? Rani ki Vav at Patan. Officially, it was commissioned by Queen Udayamati in memory of her husband, King Bhima I, which is a beautiful story, a grieving queen digging down into the earth to honor her king with water, stone, and thousands of sculptures. On the surface, it's about love and devotion. But let's be real, it was also about politics. Udayamati ensured her dynasty's name was tied forever to a monument that literally kept people alive. It was mourning and marketing in the same package. Royal women were particularly associated with stepwells. Why? Partly because water was linked to fertility, purity, and life, domains often symbolically tied to women. And partly because building a well was one of the few big public projects queens could visibly commission. In a world where their influence was often confined to the palace, funding a stepwell let them carve their names into history. And it worked. Many stepwells still carry the names of queens: Rani ki Vav, the Queen's Stepwell, Rudabai Stepwell in Adalai, built by the wife of a local chief. These weren't anonymous royal ladies. They ensured their titles were carved into stone as firmly as any king's conquests. Kings, meanwhile, also loved stepwells, but often framed them as pious acts. Inscriptions boast of rulers who gave water to the thirsty and dug deep into the earth to bring life. Some compared themselves to gods who brought cosmic waters to the world, which is a very dramatic way of saying, I built a well. But hey, propaganda is propaganda. And of course, water projects had political payoff. If you ruled a dry region and you built a well that ensured survival in a drought, your subjects remembered. They saw you as both divine and practical. A king who couldn't provide water? Forget it. A king who could. His rule looked a lot stronger. The Mughals, who later dominated much of India, also inherited this tradition. They preferred grand gardens and canals, but they didn't ignore stepwells entirely. Some Mughal nobles commissioned baolis, stepwells, near caravan routes, to provide water and rest for travelers. Others built them in forts and cities as reliable reservoirs. For them, it wasn't about sculpture-filled temples but about practicality and imperial generosity. A Mughal stepwell might lack dancing apsaras on the walls, but it still carried the same symbolism: ruler as provider, master of water. But rulers didn't always commission wells just out of generosity. Sometimes they were acts of penance. Legends tell of kings who built stepwells after committing sins, as a way to cleanse themselves symbolically by giving water to others. It's the medieval equivalent of trying to atone for bad PR by cutting a big charity check. The people got their water, the king got his redemption narrative, and everyone went home happy. We should also mention the smaller patrons, local chiefs, wealthy merchants, landowners. Stepwells weren't always imperial projects. A rich trader might fund one near a caravan route, ensuring travelers had water, and remembered his generosity. A village head might commission one to ensure survival in dry years. Stepwells could be grand, yes, but they could also be community projects, their construction woven into local pride. And the patrons often made sure their names were remembered. Inscriptions carved into lintels and pillars proudly declared who funded the well, often in flowery Sanskrit or Persian verse. So-and-so, the pious, the generous, the divine, dug deep into the earth, brought forth water, and saved the people. Subtlety was not the goal. You weren't just building a well. You were writing your dynasty into stone, one bucket at a time. But the most fascinating thing is how stepwells blurred roles. They were civic projects, religious spaces, memorials, and political propaganda all at once. When Queen Udayamati commissioned Rani ki Vav, she wasn't just honoring her husband. She was feeding a city, proclaiming her dynasty's power, and carving her own name into eternity. A staircase into water became a ladder into history. So tonight, imagine one of these inaugurations. A king or queen standing proudly at the edge of a newly finished stepwell. Priests chanting, pouring milk and flowers into the water to consecrate it. Villagers cheering, rushing down to fetch the first pots. The ruler smiling, already thinking about the inscription that would tell future generations who made this miracle possible. And then, centuries later, their name still echoes, faint but unbroken, through the cool silence of the stone steps. So far, we've mostly treated stepwells as if they were one thing. A big staircase, some carvings, a queen's name on the lintel. But stepwells weren't uniform. They shifted with geography, culture, and dynasty. India is too big, too varied, to do things just one way. Let's start in Gujarat, the undisputed capital of fancy stepwells. This was the land of the Solankis and later dynasties who took the concept of a simple water tank and said, "Cool, but what if we turned it into a subterranean palace?" Gujarat's climate demanded ingenuity. Dry plains, scarce rivers, unpredictable rains. Stepwells here weren't just reservoirs, they were survival systems. And because Gujarati rulers loved spectacle, they built them with flair. Take Rani ki Vav, of course, 7 levels of sculpture, Vishnu reclining, apsaras dancing, thousands of carvings staring at you from every wall. Walking down is like descending through an art gallery curated by gods. Or Adalai Stepwell, near Ahmedabad, built in the 15th century. It combines Hindu, Jain, and Islamic motifs, floral patterns, carved pillars, arches. Because Gujarat was a crossroads of cultures, and apparently everyone wanted their design tastes chiseled into the well. The story goes it was commissioned by a queen, Rudabai, after her husband was killed, and later finished by a Muslim sultan. Politics, grief, and cultural fusion all carved into stone stairs. Now head north into Rajasthan, and the tone shifts. Here, the land is harsher. The desert creeps in. Wells here had to be massive, not just to store water, but to impress upon people that yes, survival was possible. Enter Chand Baori in Abhanari, perhaps the most famous stepwell in the world. Imagine a giant inverted pyramid, 13 stories deep, lined with 3,500 perfectly symmetrical steps. From above, it looks like a geometric labyrinth, staircases zigzagging down into shadow. It's stark, hypnotic, a dizzying plunge into geometry. Chand Baori wasn't about decoration. There are a few shrines, yes, but the power is in its sheer scale. It's overwhelming. You don't wander down casually. You stare, blink, and wonder how on earth villagers use this every day without falling. But they did. For 1,000 years, people climbed those steps, filled their pots, and climbed back up, steady as ants on an anthill. Other Rajasthani stepwells, like those in Jodhpur or Jaipur, followed similar patterns. Bold, geometric, practical, but still oddly beautiful. Their symmetry was their decoration. In a desert, you didn't need dancing apsaras. The play of light and shadow across stone was artwork enough. Then we drift east to Delhi and the Mughal north. Here, the wells were called Baolis. They were less ornate, less temple-like, and more functional, tied to forts, caravan routes, and gardens. The Mughals weren't obsessed with stair-filled pyramids, they preferred canals and fountains. But they still built Baolis because groundwater mattered, and even emperors can't live without water. Take Agrasan Ki Baoli, right in the heart of modern Delhi. Today it's surrounded by glass towers and traffic, but descend its long, stark staircase and you're in another world. The noise fades. Pigeons flutter in the shadows. The walls close in. It's unadorned compared to Gujarat's masterpieces, but no less haunting. Legend says it was originally built by the legendary King Agrasan, later rebuilt in the medieval period. Tourists wander it now, whispering about ghost stories, because apparently every old well in Delhi must be haunted, but originally it was just a lifeline, a civic reservoir wrapped in stone. Other Baolis in Delhi include Rajan Ki Baoli, built by the Lodi dynasty, with elegant arches and quiet chambers, and Gandak Ki Baoli, known for its sulphur-smelling water. These were simpler, yes, but they carried the same symbolism: shade, survival, sanctuary. Meanwhile, in Madhya Pradesh, you find hybrid designs, wells that are part temple, part tank. Here, stepwells often served pilgrim routes, tucked near shrines or on trade paths. They weren't as deep as Gujarat's or as grand as Rajasthan's, but they were essential stops for weary travelers. Imagine walking across central India in the 12th century, hot, dusty, tired, and stumbling on one of these shaded wells. It was life-saving, and probably felt divine whether the carvings were fancy or not. And then there's the regional quirk of fusion designs. Over time, as Islamic rulers gained influence, stepwells began incorporating arches, domes, and calligraphy into their structures. Instead of only gods carved into walls, you'd see geometric floral patterns or Quranic inscriptions. The basic function remained the same, but the decoration shifted. Stepwells became cultural chameleons, absorbing whatever dynasty happened to rule above ground. Despite all these variations, a few things held constant. The stairs, the coolness, the echo. Whether it was the ornate depths of Rani Ki Vav, the dizzying geometry of Chand Baori, or the stark arches of Delhi's Baolis, every stepwell was a world apart. From above, you might see only a hole in the ground. From below, you entered another realm entirely. So tonight, picture traveling across India centuries ago. You pass through Gujarat. Ornate sculptures greet you as you descend. You move into Rajasthan. Endless zigzagging steps plunge into shadow. You reach Delhi. Plain, arched chambers echo with pigeon wings. Different styles, different dynasties, but always the same feeling: shade, silence, and water waiting at the bottom. Every region carved its own version of eternity. By the late medieval period, stepwells had reached their peak: deep, elaborate, covered in carvings, symbols, and dynastic pride. But like so many monuments, their fortunes shifted. New rulers, new technologies, and changing habits slowly dimmed their importance. The wells didn't vanish overnight. They just slipped into silence. The decline came with a mix of reasons. First, the arrival of new water systems. As empires expanded and technology changed, rulers built canals, aqueducts, and later, modern reservoirs. Stepwells were useful, yes, but they couldn't compete with massive hydraulic projects that could feed whole cities. Slowly, they became secondary, charming, but not essential. The Mughal emperors, while practical, weren't deeply invested in stepwells. They favored grand gardens, flowing fountains, and aqueduct-fed tanks. Wells were still dug, but their glory days as artistic monuments were fading. A Mughal Baoli might still echo with footsteps, but compared to the marble of the Taj Mahal, they looked more like service pits than showcases. And then came the colonial era. British officials in India, from the 18th century onward, looked at stepwells with a mix of confusion and suspicion. To them, they were unhygienic: too many people, too much stagnant water, too many chances for disease. The British preferred pipes, pumps, and tanks. Wells, they decided, were outdated. Some were abandoned outright. Others were filled in. Reports from the 19th century describe once grand stepwells choked with silt, their carvings eroded, goats clambering down where apsaras once danced. Colonial engineers sometimes marveled at their scale, but rarely preserved them. They were too practical-minded, too focused on modernizing water supply. Stepwells slipped from lifelines into relics. But here's the strange thing: even as the great dynastic wells faded, smaller ones kept being used. Villagers still fetched water from them, even if officials disapproved. Children still played on the steps. Pilgrims still lit lamps at shrines tucked into their walls. The grandeur was gone, but the daily rhythm lingered quietly. By the 20th century, many stepwells were half ruins, forgotten except by locals. Travelers stumbled across them and wrote descriptions tinged with awe. A subterranean palace, one called it. An inverted temple. Photographs captured zigzagging stairs disappearing into shadow. Slowly, the outside world began to notice again. Archaeologists traced their histories. Heritage groups began restoring them. Rani Ki Vav, once silted up and nearly lost, was excavated in the 20th century and revealed in its glory. Thousands of carvings intact beneath the earth. In 2014, It was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What had been buried for centuries returned, silent but magnificent. Tourism followed. Today, visitors descend into Chand Baori's dizzying geometry, or stare in or at the carvings of Rani ki Vav, or wander Delhi's Agrasan ki Baoli, now a popular film location. Ironically, the stepwells built for survival are now appreciated more as art. People no longer fetch water there. They fetch selfies. And yet, not all stepwells are ruins for tourists. In villages across India, smaller wells are still used. Women still descend daily, balancing plastic containers instead of clay pots. Children still splash. The water is still drawn, step by step, as it always was. These are living stepwells, not just heritage monuments. Practical, ordinary, woven into daily life. The Kutb Shohi Stepwell project in Hyderabad is one example of modern revival. Abandoned wells are being restored, cleaned, and reused as sources of water. Communities are reconnecting with them, both for heritage and for survival. In a world facing water shortages, the old technology suddenly looks wise again. But beyond practicality, stepwells endure as symbols. They represent quietness, dissent, reflection. In modern India, bustling, noisy, crowded, a stepwell still feels like another world. Walk down its stairs, and the traffic fades. The air cools. The echo of your footsteps reminds you of centuries past. They are also reminders of forgotten voices, especially the queens and noblewomen who commissioned them, carving their names into stone when few other avenues of power were open to them. Udayamati, Rudabai, their wells remain, their names whispered in silence long after their dynasties crumbled. And there's something about the atmosphere that no technology can replace. A water tank or pump can keep you alive, yes. But a stepwell offers something more, a ritual of descent, a moment of pause, a connection to silence and shadow. Even today, visitors describe them as eerie, dreamlike, calming. Perfect places to get lost in thought. Perfect places to feel small. But elsewhere, something different was unfolding. We're not descending into stepwells or wandering through glowing lanterns anymore. Instead, the path ahead is far older, less dazzling. A trail that doesn't glitter with armies or palaces, but with something humbler, lumps of golden fossilized resin. Amber. Or, as the Romans poetically called it, the tears of the sun. Much lovelier than tree sap that got stuck in the dirt for a few million years, right? So get comfortable. Picture yourself on a road winding through ancient forests, the smell of pine heavy in the air. Traders shuffle past with packs on their backs. In their hands, they carry beads and chunks of amber, glowing, translucent, catching the light like trapped drops of honey. This was the Amber Road, one of Europe's oldest trade networks. A path not of empires, but of resin. Not of swords, but of jewelry. Amber is simple and strange. It starts as tree resin, hardened over thousands, sometimes millions, of years. It washes up along the shores of the Baltic Sea, glittering like little suns after a storm. Pick it up, polish it, and suddenly you've got a gem. Not as flashy as gold, but lighter, warmer, and full of mystery. Some pieces even had insects trapped inside, frozen forever mid-crawl. For ancient people, amber wasn't just pretty. It was magic. The Greeks called it electron, from which we get electricity, because when rubbed it produced static sparks. They thought it held the essence of the sun. The Romans adored it, wearing it as amulets, filling their villas with amber trinkets, even grinding it into powder to swallow as medicine. Spoiler, it didn't work. But when has that ever stopped anyone? So how do you get amber from the Baltic shores down to Rome? You need roads. Paths through forests, rivers, mountains, valleys. And not just one road, but many, strands of a web that carried amber south, linking Germanic tribes, Celtic settlements, Greek colonies, and finally Roman markets. Together, these strands became known as the Amber Road. Unlike the Silk Road, which carried silk, spices, and way too much political drama, the Amber Road was quieter. Less glamorous, maybe, but just as enduring. People were trading amber along these routes as early as the Neolithic. By the Bronze Age, it was everywhere. In Mycenaean tombs, in Egyptian necklaces, in Celtic hoards. A fossilized sun bead could travel thousands of miles, passed from hand to hand, shining just as brightly in a pharaoh's necklace as it did on a Baltic beach. Now, let's imagine a journey along this road. Start at the Baltic coast, maybe in what's now Lithuania or Poland. Storms have washed amber onto the beaches, glittering among the seaweed. Local tribes collect it, men, women, children, combing the sand, filling baskets with lumps of resin. Some pieces are small, barely worth stringing into beads. Others are big enough to carve into amulets. The traders know the value. Southerners will pay a fortune for this strange northern stone. From there, the amber travels inland. Traders walk forest paths, cross rivers, stop at villages. Along the way, they swap amber for furs, salt, or grain. Slowly, the resin moves south, through the forests of Central Europe, across the Danube, into the lands of the Celts, and eventually toward the Alps. At each stop, it picks up new stories, new owners, new prices. By the time it reaches the Mediterranean, the resin that once washed up for free on a stormy Baltic beach has become treasure. A Mycenaean warrior might be buried with amber beads strung into his jewelry. A Greek trader in Athens might sell amber amulets to parents hoping to protect their children from illness. A Roman matron might wear an amber necklace at a dinner party, telling her friends it came from the far edge of the world. And in a way, it did. Amber's value came not just from beauty, but from mystery. The Greeks believed it was formed from the tears of the Heliades, sisters who wept endlessly after their brother Phaeton fell from the sky. Their tears, hardened by the sun, dropped into rivers as amber, which is more poetic than old tree goo, so we'll give them points for imagination. Others thought amber had healing powers. Wear it against your skin, and it might cure ailments. Grind it up and drink it, and it might fix a cough. Mothers tied amber beads around children's necks to protect them. Roman doctors prescribed it as medicine. Of course, none of this actually worked, but again, people still drink kale smoothies hoping for immortality, so nothing much has changed. The Amber Road wasn't one fixed highway, but a shifting network. Over centuries, routes branched and changed. Some followed the Vistula River down into Central Europe. Others crossed the Danube, heading into Alpine passes. Some linked to Adriatic ports, sending amber by ship to Greece and Italy. By the Roman era, entire trade routes were formalized. Soldiers marched them, merchants guarded them, maps were drawn. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who wrote about basically everything, from elephants to erupting volcanoes, tells us that Rome loved amber so much that gladiators' nets were decorated with it. Which is honestly a strange use of resin that breaks if you step on it. But Romans were never known for moderation. Pliny himself admitted amber was ridiculously overpriced, but shrugged and noted that fashion has never been logical. He wasn't wrong. And here's the funny part. While Romans adored amber, the people who actually lived near the Baltic probably thought it was just normal. Like shells on a beach. Useful for trade, sure, but not worth worshipping. It was only when amber traveled south, gaining stories and superstitions, that it became exotic. Which means that some farmer in Lithuania was probably laughing at the idea of Roman senators paying gold for something his kid had picked up by accident while building a sandcastle. So tonight, let's stop here on the northern end of the road. Picture a Baltic beach after a storm. The sky is grey, the sea rough. Waves crash, leaving behind little golden lumps tangled in seaweed. A child picks one up, holds it to the light, sees it glow. He pockets it. In a few months, that lump will travel forests, rivers, mountains, and empires. It will sit on a necklace in Greece, or on an altar in Rome. But for now, it's just a drop of sun, waiting. The Amber Road has begun. So, we left off on a Baltic beach, with lumps of amber glinting in the sand. Children picked them up, traders gathered them, and slowly they began to travel south. Now let's see where those glowing beads ended up. Spoiler, basically everywhere that mattered. By the Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1000 BCE, amber was already a superstar. Archaeologists find it in Mycenaean shaft graves, those deep tombs filled with swords, masks, and other flashy grave goods. Amid the gold and bronze, there are humble amber beads, drops of fossilized resin that had somehow made their way from a cold Baltic beach to a Greek warrior's neck. But Pliny also admitted amber was irresistible. He described how children wore it as protection against illness, how doctors ground it into powder for medicine, and how women flaunted it as jewelry. He even mentions it being carved into little figurines of animals, which wealthy Romans collected like knickknacks. Imagine a villa shelf lined with tiny amber dogs and birds, the world's first Etsy shop of luxury resin crafts. And here's where Rome did what Rome always did: turn superstition into bureaucracy. They taxed amber. They regulated its trade. They ensured the empire got its cut. And in return, they gave merchants safer passage along the routes, backed by Roman legions and milestones. Amber flowed south in steady streams, enriching not just traders but also the state. Daily life along the road changed too. Inns popped up along the highways, offering food and beds to weary traders. Local villagers learned that if you hung around near the road, you might sell a few apples, a jug of wine, or offer to carry packs for a coin. Caravan life became routine. You'd see traders with sacks of amber beads, alongside merchants hauling salt, wine, or pottery. The Amber Road was never just about amber. It was about everything else that traveled with it: gossip, news, cultures blending at crossroads. And then there's the strange fact that Romans actually sent official expeditions north to secure amber. Tacitus, another Roman writer, describes how Roman nobles in the time of Emperor Nero marched into Germanic lands, not to conquer, but to collect resin. At one festival, Nero reportedly had an entire gladiatorial arena decorated with amber. Nets, weapons, even the stage itself. Because why not? When you're an emperor known for fiddling while Rome burns, you might as well decorate your circus with fossilized sunlight. But amber wasn't just pretty. It was symbolic. Romans saw it as a link to the mysterious north, the lands of forests, fog, and tribes they couldn't quite tame. Owning amber was like owning a piece of the exotic frontier, a tangible reminder that the empire stretched beyond the familiar Mediterranean. Wearing amber was both fashion and statement. I can afford something that traveled hundreds of miles from the edge of the world. And then there was the superstition. Rome was drenched in it. Amber was believed to protect against sorcery, illness, and misfortune. Mothers hung it around their babies' necks to keep them safe. Soldiers carried it into battle, convinced it would shield them. Doctors recommended it for fevers, coughs, even madness. If you think that's silly, remember that people today still buy healing crystals and wear copper bracelets for arthritis. The Romans were no different. They just had fancier taste in resin. But for all the glamour in Rome, the road itself was still walked by ordinary traders. Picture a merchant trudging south with a sack of amber, sandals dusty, stopping at a roadside inn for wine and bread. Maybe he trades a bead for a warm blanket. Maybe he haggles with locals for safe passage. His journey is slow, repetitive, and not nearly as glamorous as the final product looks in a senator's villa. Every glowing bead in Rome passed through countless ordinary, tired hands. So tonight, let's pause on the Roman section of the Amber Road. Imagine the paved highway stretching straight across the landscape, flanked by milestones. Traders shuffle along, carts creak, soldiers patrol. At the end of the road, Aquileia waits, its workshops buzzing, craftsmen polishing lumps of resin into gleaming ornaments. Rome adored amber. It taxed it, carved it, overpaid for it, and bragged about it. But the road, the endless trail from the Baltic forests to the Roman villas, was where its real story lived. So far, we've looked at amber as treasure, sparkling in Mycenaean tombs, adorning Roman matrons, and making Pliny roll his eyes at the price tags. But none of that happens without the endless, anonymous footsteps of people who walked the road itself. So let's spend some time with them: the traders, the guides, the locals, the people for whom the Amber Road wasn't exotic. It was just Tuesday. Picture a Baltic trader setting out in the early Roman period. He's not a wealthy merchant. Not yet. He's a man with a sack of amber beads strung on cords, maybe some larger chunks polished into pendants. He ties them carefully, slings the sack over his back, and begins walking south. He knows he won't reach Rome himself. He'll trade with other men long before that. But he knows the value, or at least, the promise of value. Somewhere far away, people will pay handsomely for what the sea left lying on the beach. His journey is slow. He walks through forests thick with pine, across rivers that need ferries or fords, past villages where children stare and dogs bark. At each stop, he trades. Maybe he leaves a string of amber beads in exchange for a fur, or for salt, or for a carved bronze brooch. He sleeps in huts, in inns, sometimes under the stars. Step by step, the amber moves onward. Meanwhile, there are the middlemen, Celtic tribes in Central Europe who see amber pass through their lands and decide to make a business of it. They don't live near the Baltic, but they know a good thing when they see it. They collect amber from northern traders, then carry it further south, marking up the price as they go. They also add a little flair, perhaps they repolish the beads, or mix them into local jewelry styles. By the time a Roman buyer sees them, the beads look like Celtic goods, even if they started life on a Baltic beach. These middlemen weren't just traders. They were cultural brokers. Along with amber, they carried gossip, songs, myths, and styles. Archaeologists find Celtic designs in Roman jewelry, Roman coins in Celtic hoards, Greek pottery in Celtic villages. All of that moved along the same routes, alongside the lumps of resin. Then there are the innkeepers. Imagine running a roadside inn along the amber road. Traders pass through, tired and dusty, carrying sacks of beads. You feed them bread, wine, maybe stew. You give them a place to sleep, straw on the floor. In return, you get coins, stories, or perhaps a bead of amber itself. Over time, your inn walls are decorated with tiny lumps of fossilized sun, left behind by countless travelers. You never leave your village, but amber still comes to you. And let's not forget the locals, who probably had a very different perspective. For villagers along the route, amber was a curiosity, but not always a treasure. To them, it was just something outsiders seemed obsessed with. Imagine watching a trader eagerly swap a cow for a sack of glowing beads. You shake your head. Why would anyone give up good livestock for tree resin? But then again, if fools will pay, why not sell? Trade is trade. Life on the road wasn't glamorous. Travel was slow, risky, and repetitive. Roads wound through forests filled with wolves, across rivers that could flood, over mountains that froze in winter. Bandits lurked, waiting to snatch valuable cargo. To survive, traders often traveled in groups, little caravans of men and pack animals trudging south together, safer in numbers. Imagine them at night, sitting by a fire in a clearing, eating hard bread, sipping watered wine, trading stories. One boasts that he'll reach Aquileia by summer. Another grumbles that his feet are blistered. A third quietly counts the beads in his sack, praying none have been stolen. They all fall asleep with the road humming in their dreams. Amber also moved through markets. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient marketplaces where amber beads appear alongside bronze tools, pottery, and salt. For most people, amber wasn't an unattainable luxury. A small bead might be within reach of an ordinary family, worn as a charm or tied to a child's clothing. In these markets, amber wasn't exotic. It was just another item on the table, next to bread and cloth. And then there's the strange, quiet role of pilgrims and priests. Amber wasn't just traded as jewelry. It carried sacred weight. Some shrines in Central Europe have yielded amber offerings, beads dropped into rivers, buried in pits, or left at altars. To them, amber wasn't currency. It was devotion. A bead placed before a god was a prayer made solid. That piece of fossilized sunlight became a message to the divine. Through all this, the road itself was alive. Not in the dramatic sense of battles or armies, but in the hum of daily footsteps. Dogs barking at strangers. Fires crackling at inns. The creak of wagons. The quiet clink of beads in a pouch. So tonight, as we pause on a forested stretch of the Amber Road, picture it, a narrow path winding through tall pines, the air heavy with resin and damp soil. A group of traders shuffle past, packs slung over their backs, sandals muddy. Ahead, the faint smoke of an inn curls above the trees. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howl, but the firelight promises safety. The beads in their sacks glow faintly when they catch the moonlight, like trapped suns guiding them south. The road is ordinary. The road is endless. The road is alive. Rome, of course, didn't last forever. Roads crumble, armies scatter, emperors lose their grip. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was gone. But Amber didn't care. The resin still washed up on Baltic beaches after storms. People still picked it up. Traders still carried it south. The empire collapsed, but the beads kept moving. In the centuries after Rome, Europe became a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and shifting borders. But the amber road didn't vanish. It simply adapted. Instead of Roman officials taxing the trade, local chieftains or early medieval lords demanded tribute. Instead of Roman workshops in Aquileia polishing resin, new centers of craft popped up in monasteries, towns, or local courts. Amber continued to show up in burials. Early medieval graves in Central Europe, Germany, and Scandinavia contain amber beads and amulets. Sometimes they're simple, sometimes elaborately carved. To these new societies, amber still carried its ancient aura of protection and mystery. Wearing amber meant you were guarded against illness, bad luck, or worse. By the Viking Age, amber was booming again. The Vikings, ever the entrepreneurs, realized the Baltic shores were littered with treasure that southern buyers craved. They gathered amber and traded it south, alongside furs, slaves, and other goods. Viking traders carried amber down rivers into Slavic lands, across to the Black Sea, and even toward the Middle East. For them, amber was just another line item in their global business plan, a resin-powered side hustle. It's telling that some Viking graves contain amber beads alongside silver and weapons. To a Viking, amber was both adornment and trade good. A bracelet of amber wasn't just pretty, it was portable wealth. If needed, you could break it apart and trade the beads for supplies on your next river journey. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, amber began attaching itself to Christianity. Old pagan beliefs that amber protected the soul didn't disappear, they were just baptized. Monks carved amber into rosary beads. Priests recommended wearing amber crosses for protection. Churches stored amber relics, claiming divine power flowed through the resin. The fossilized sun was now fossilized faith. Amber also became a staple of medieval medicine, much as it had been in Rome. Doctors ground it into powders, prescribing it for fevers, stomach ailments, or even the plague. Inhaling amber smoke was believed to cleanse the lungs. Spoiler, it didn't. But patients were willing to pay anyway. Once again, superstition kept the beads moving south. The political centers of amber shifted too. By the High Middle Ages, the Teutonic Knights, a military order that controlled parts of the Baltic coast, realized the value of what washed up on their beaches. They didn't just collect amber. They monopolized it. Peasants on the Baltic shores were forbidden to sell amber without handing it over to the knights first. Anyone caught smuggling could face harsh penalties. Suddenly, what had once been free treasure on the sand became tightly controlled wealth. The Amber Road was less about wandering traders and more about organized extraction under the cross and sword. And the demand kept growing. By the 13th and 14th centuries, amber workshops flourished in towns like Gdansk, Königsberg, and Lübeck. Craftsmen carved rosaries, reliquaries, and delicate figurines. Amber guilds regulated quality, prices, and trade. What had once been casual beads swapped by Celts was now a regulated industry tied to Christian Europe's spiritual life. But through all this, the essence of the Amber Road remained. Lumps of fossilized resin still started on Baltic beaches, washed up by storms. They still passed from hand to hand, north to south, slowly transforming from raw nuggets into sacred beads or luxury ornaments. Empires fell, religions shifted, but the beads stayed stubbornly on the move. It's easy to forget how constant the road was. Bronze Age chiefs, Roman senators, Viking traders, medieval monks, all of them touched the same resin, carried it in pouches, strung it into beads, told stories about its power. The names changed, the myths changed, but the glow stayed the same. So tonight, as we wander into medieval Europe, picture a monastery workshop. A monk in a dimly lit cell holds a lump of amber in his hand, warm against his skin. He carves it slowly into beads for a rosary, murmuring prayers as he works. Outside, traders haggle in the marketplace, sacks of amber arriving from the Baltic, coins clinking in exchange. Far to the north, peasants still comb the beaches after storms, scooping up little suns from the sand. The road endures. The empires do not. By the late Middle Ages, Amber was no longer just a bead swapped in markets or strung on Celtic necklaces. It had become an industry, regulated, taxed, guarded. Guilds of amber craftsmen in places like Gdansk and Königsberg turned lumps of resin into rosaries, crucifixes, boxes, and delicate carvings. The glow of amber moved from pagan shrines into churches, monasteries, and wealthy courts. But the fascination never faded. In the Renaissance, amber was a curiosity in cabinets of wonder, those eclectic collections of seashells, stuffed animals, and strange minerals that wealthy Europeans hoarded to prove how cultured they were. A lump of amber with a fly or spider trapped inside was particularly prized. Imagine the ore, an insect frozen mid-step, sealed in golden resin for millions of years. To Renaissance collectors, this wasn't just pretty. It was proof of nature's secrets, time itself bottled. And then, in the Baroque age, amber became spectacular. Northern Europe, especially the Baltic coast, was still the main source. Prussia claimed monopoly over it, ensuring that every bead and block passed through their hands. Craftsmen in Königsberg carved amber into ornate jewelry, furniture, even entire wall panels. Which brings us, inevitably, to the most famous amber creation of all, the Amber Room. The Amber Room began in the early 18th century, commissioned in Prussia and eventually gifted to Peter the Great of Russia. Imagine an entire chamber, every wall covered in amber panels, mosaics, carvings, and gilded frames. Golden resin glowed from floor to ceiling, catching candlelight and shimmering like a room made of fossilized sunlight. Visitors were dazzled. It became known as the eighth wonder of the world. Of course, as with most treasures, the Amber Room's story turned tragic. During World War II, it was looted by the Nazis, transported to Königsberg, and then vanished. Some say it was destroyed in bombings. Others whisper it still exists, hidden in a bunker or mine. Today, a painstaking reconstruction glows in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, but the original remains lost, a reminder that amber's journey, like the road itself, is never quite finished. Beyond spectacle, amber remained practical in its own weird way. Early modern physicians still prescribed it for ailments. Powdered amber was mixed into tonics. Amber smoke was inhaled as a supposed cure for asthma. People wore amber beads to protect against illness, even during outbreaks of plague. Spoiler, again, it didn't help. But the ritual continued, proof that the resin's magical reputation still clung to it after thousands of years. And in daily life, amber kept glowing. Villagers still picked it from Baltic beaches after storms. Children still strung beads. Merchants still carried sacks south to markets. Even as Europe industrialized, the humble routine of combing the sand for golden lumps continued, unchanged from the Bronze Age. Today, amber is less about survival or superstition, and more about memory. Tourists buy necklaces and bracelets from shops in Poland or Lithuania. Museums display beads from Mycenaean tombs, reminding us of journeys long past. Scientists study insects preserved in amber, glimpsing worlds millions of years old. Tiny flies, spiders, even feathers frozen in golden prisons. Each bead is a time capsule, holding both the deep past of nature and the long history of human desire. So what does the Amber Road mean now? It isn't just a trade route. It's a reminder that history doesn't always move with armies or kings. Sometimes it moves with beads of resin, carried by tired traders, polished by craftsmen, worn by queens, prayed over by monks. Sometimes the glow of a tiny object outlasts entire empires. Meanwhile, in another corner of history, we're not trudging across mountains or descending into stone wells. This time, we're sitting at a desk. A very, very old desk, covered in scrolls, ink stains, and a map that looks nothing like the actual Earth. Because here we meet the ancient mapmakers, and especially Claudius Ptolemy, the man who tried to draw the world before anyone had actually seen most of it. So dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let's relax while we watch a group of ancient scholars argue about coastlines they've never visited. Let's start with the basics. Humans have always been obsessed with knowing where things are. Even before GPS, even before globes, people tried to sketch their surroundings. The earliest maps we know of are basically doodles on clay tablets or carvings on walls. They're not accurate in the modern sense, but they told people what mattered, where the river is, where the mountains are, and, most importantly, where the neighbors you'd rather avoid live. By the time we get to ancient Greece and Rome, maps start getting ambitious. Philosophers wanted to map not just villages or valleys, but the whole world. Which is adorable, considering that most of them hadn't been more than 50 miles from home. But they were confident. Too confident. Enter Claudius Ptolemy. 2nd century CE. Living in Alexandria, the city with the great library, the intellectual hotspot of the ancient world. Ptolemy was a polymath. He wrote on astronomy, optics, math, and, most famously, geography. His great work, the Geographia, was essentially a user's manual for building the world on paper. What made Ptolemy different wasn't that he drew a map, though he did. It was that he provided a system. He gathered the known locations of cities, rivers, and mountains, and then assigned them coordinates. Latitude and longitude. In other words, he turned geography into math. Which sounds impressive until you realize that many of his coordinates were hilariously wrong. But still, it was the thought that counted. Now, to be fair, Ptolemy wasn't completely making things up. He collected reports from travelers, merchants, and earlier writers. He cross-checked data where he could. But this was still a world without satellite imaging, without global exploration, without accurate clocks to calculate longitude. So his maps included some creative liberties. For example, he stretched the Mediterranean way too far east-west, making it look like an oversized lake. He assumed the Indian Ocean was landlocked, closed off by a massive southern continent. And he had a tendency to shrink Africa while expanding Asia to ridiculous proportions. Basically, the world he drew was a bit like looking at Earth in a funhouse mirror. But here's the thing, his system was so thorough, so convincing, that people took it seriously for more than 1,000 years. The Geographia became the go-to reference in the medieval and Renaissance world. Monks copied it, Arab scholars translated it, European printers reissued it with fancy Renaissance artwork. For centuries, Ptolemy's squashed pancake Earth was the Earth people believed in. So let's picture this, a medieval scribe hunched over his desk, painstakingly copying Ptolemy's coordinates onto parchment. Candlelight flickers. Ink drips. He traces coastlines is never seen, drawing India like a sideways boot and Africa as a stubby rectangle. He doesn't care if it looks weird, it's in Ptolemy, so it must be right. After all, Ptolemy was authoritative. And once you've decided something's authoritative, accuracy is optional. Ptolemy also gave us a delightful assortment of mythical geography. In his world, there were lands filled with cinnamon trees, regions where dog-headed people might live, and rivers flowing from mysterious mountains that no one had actually located. Later mapmakers dutifully copied these into their atlases, decorating margins with sea monsters and imaginary tribes. Because if you're going to be wrong, at least be wrong with style. One of the ironies is that Ptolemy's maps were partly forgotten in the West after Rome collapsed, but preserved and expanded in the Islamic Golden Age. Arab scholars translated his Geographia in the 9th century, added corrections based on their own travels, and used it to create some of the most stunning medieval maps. Which means that while Europeans were doodling circles labeled "Here be dragons," scholars in Baghdad were refining coordinate tables and redrawing coastlines. Once again, Europe was late to the party. When Ptolemy finally made his grand comeback in Europe in the 15th century, thanks to printed editions, he became a celebrity again. Renaissance explorers carried Ptolemaic maps as they set out to discover new lands. Which is both touching and tragic, because Ptolemy's world was wildly inaccurate. Columbus himself consulted Ptolemy, which helps explain why he thought sailing west to Asia was such a great idea. If your map tells you Asia is only a hop, skip, and a jump across the Atlantic, of course you'll pack 3 ships and go. Surprise, there's a whole continent in between. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, in part 1, we're just setting the scene. Alexandria. Ptolemy at his desk. Scrolls scattered, wax tablets filled with calculations, a half-finished papyrus map unrolled across the table. Outside, the harbor bustles with ships bringing spices, grain, and rumors from far-off lands. Inside, Ptolemy tries to piece together a world no one has fully seen. It's ambitious, it's flawed, and it's going to shape geography for over a millennium. So, Ptolemy didn't just wake up one morning and decide to invent geography. He was standing on the shoulders of people who had been doodling maps and making wild guesses for centuries. Some were brilliant. Some were hilariously wrong. All of them contributed to the strange jigsaw puzzle of world maps before anyone actually knew what the world looked like. Let's start with the Babylonians, because of course it always starts with the Babylonians. They carved some of the earliest surviving maps into clay tablets. Imagine it, a circle representing the world, with the city of Babylon plopped proudly in the center. Surrounding it, the Euphrates River, some mountains, and a big watery circle labeled the Bitter River, aka the ocean. Beyond that, little wedges pointing outward, labeled with things like place where demons live or land of great darkness. It's less Google Maps, more our village, plus some vague scary stuff at the edges. To be fair, it was the 6th century BCE. They were doing their best. But it's a reminder that early maps weren't about accuracy. They were about worldview. Babylon was the center because, well, where else would it be? Then we get the Greeks, who, as usual, couldn't resist theorizing about everything. They gave us philosophers like Anaximander, who in the 6th century BCE supposedly made one of the first maps of the known world. His version was a disk, flat, circular, surrounded by ocean, with Greece looking suspiciously important. Imagine drawing Earth as a plate of soup, with yourself as the garnish in the middle. A little later, Hecataeus of Miletus improved on that, though improved is relative. His map included Europe, Asia, and Libya, their word for North Africa. It still looked like a blob drawn by someone who'd never left the Aegean, but at least he tried to catalogue peoples and places. Baby steps. And then comes Herodotus, the so-called father of history. He loved describing far-off lands, though accuracy was not his strong suit. His map of the world, or at least his description of it, includes rivers flowing the wrong way, people living at the edge of the earth with dog heads, and giant ants digging up gold in India. 10 out of 10 for entertainment value, 2 out of 10 for cartography. But then things start getting clever. Enter Eratosthenes, the librarian of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. He did something extraordinary. He measured the earth. Or at least, he came pretty close. Using the angle of shadows in 2 different cities at noon, and some math, he calculated Earth's circumference within a few hundred miles of the actual figure. Which is honestly insane when you think about it. No satellites, no GPS, just shadows and geometry. Eratosthenes was that kid in class who actually liked word problems. He also sketched out a world map with parallels and meridians, the earliest attempt at a coordinate grid. Sound familiar? Yep. Ptolemy would later borrow heavily from Eratosthenes' ideas. Then there was Hipparchus, a century later. He refined Eratosthenes' work, proposing a formal system of latitude and longitude. Latitude, based on the angle of the sun. Longitude, based on time differences, though without accurate clocks, that part was basically guesswork. Still, he laid the groundwork. Ptolemy would later sweep in, take all that, and act like he'd invented it. Classic move. Of course, not everyone was as logical. Some Greek philosophers insisted the earth was flat, others that it was shaped like a drum, and a few got creative with donut-shaped models. But gradually, the spherical earth theory won out, thanks largely to Aristotle, who pointed out little things like the curve of Earth's shadow on the moon during an eclipse. Observing eclipses instead of debating endlessly? Revolutionary. By the time of the early Roman Empire, there was a mishmash of knowledge floating around, half myth, half science. Traders brought back stories from India, Egypt, even the edges of China. Soldiers marched along frontiers and sketched rivers. Sailors hugged coastlines, describing ports and headlands. Out of all this chaos, people like Ptolemy tried to impose order. But here's the fun part. Early maps tell us more about the people than the planet. The Babylonians thought the world revolved around Babylon. The Greeks thought the Mediterranean was basically the center of the universe, with Asia and Africa as convenient side dishes. Every map was propaganda, a visual way of saying, we are the middle of everything, and everyone else lives in the margins. Ptolemy, when he finally compiled his Geographia, inherited all this baggage. He wasn't starting from scratch. He was editing centuries of half-right, half-wrong guesses, wrapping them in math, and presenting them as the definitive truth. Which is why his maps are both brilliant and deeply flawed. So tonight, picture a clay tablet in Babylon, scratched with lines and wedges. Or a Greek philosopher hunched over a parchment, drawing the world as a neat little disc with Greece proudly in the center. Or Eratosthenes, squinting at shadows, probably muttering equations while everyone else just wanted to eat lunch. They didn't know what the world looked like, but they couldn't stop trying to draw it anyway. And into that tradition, Ptolemy would eventually step, scrolls in hand, ready to redraw the world, wrong, but persuasively wrong. So far, we've wandered through Babylonian doodles and Greek shadow measuring contests. Now it's time to let Claudius Ptolemy step forward and take the stage. He's sitting at his desk in Alexandria, in the 2nd century CE, probably squinting at scrolls full of numbers, muttering in Greek, and wondering why nobody can agree on how wide the Mediterranean actually is. Ptolemy's big innovation was the Geographia, a massive compilation of the world's known places, tied together with a system of latitude and longitude. Instead of vague sketches, he tried to assign each city, river, and mountain an exact coordinate. It was the ancient world's attempt at Google Earth, except with fewer satellites and way more guesswork. Latitude, at least, was manageable. You could calculate it using the angle of the sun at noon, or by measuring how high certain stars rose above the horizon. Sailors had been doing this for ages. Longitude, however, was a nightmare. You needed precise time differences between two places, and ancient clocks were about as reliable as a sundial on a cloudy day. Which meant that longitude often devolved into educated guessing. And by educated, we mean wildly off. Take the Mediterranean. Ptolemy stretched it too far east-west, making it almost 20 degrees longer than it really is. In modern terms, that's about 1,400 miles of extra sea. According to his map, Italy, Greece, and Spain were doing a very slow-motion stretch, pulling the sea wider just to annoy future cartographers. Then there was Asia. Ptolemy had never seen it, of course. He relied on reports from traders, soldiers, and second-hand stories. He thought India bulged way too far east, pushing Southeast Asia out into an enormous, misshapen blob. He also assumed the Indian Ocean wasn't open, but landlocked, enclosed by a mysterious southern continent that no one had actually visited. It was a neat theory, if you like your oceans shaped like oversized lakes. And then Africa. Ptolemy knew North Africa fairly well, but south of the Sahara, that was a blank page. So he simply squashed the continent, made it shorter, and then attached it to that same giant southern continent. According to Ptolemy, Earth basically had a fat belt of land running around the bottom like a very ill-fitting pair of pants. But here's the thing, it looked convincing. For the first time, you had a world map that wasn't just blobs and guesses. It had numbers, coordinates, grids. You could plot locations mathematically. It felt scientific, even if the data behind it was a bit, well, shaky. And Ptolemy gave instructions. He described how to project the spherical Earth onto a flat map. He knew it couldn't be done perfectly, but he suggested methods for minimizing distortion. He explained how to draw parallels and meridians, how to arrange coastlines. In short, he gave future mapmakers a manual, even if the recipes sometimes produced cakes that looked nothing like the picture on the box. What makes this so fascinating is the confidence. Ptolemy writes as though his world is complete, as though the coordinates cover everything that matters. But in reality, his world was missing half the planet. No Americas. No Australia. No Pacific Ocean. Even large parts of Africa and Asia were blank or misdrawn. And yet, people treated his maps as gospel for centuries. There's something oddly comforting about that. Humans have always been willing to believe in a confident wrong answer over an uncertain shrug. Ptolemy didn't say, well, we don't really know what's down there. He said, here's the map. And everyone nodded, copied it, and moved on. And it wasn't all mistakes. Ptolemy did get some things right. He listed about 8,000 places, many with coordinates close enough to their real positions that you can recognize them today. His maps included Britain, India, Sri Lanka, even parts of China. Some coastlines, like the Red Sea, were surprisingly accurate. He had just enough right to make the wrong parts look convincing. One of his most famous errors was Taprobane, his name for Sri Lanka. Ptolemy thought it was about 10 times larger than reality, a massive island dominating the Indian Ocean. Medieval maps dutifully copied this giant Taprobane, giving Sri Lanka the ego boost of a lifetime. Meanwhile, actual Sri Lankans probably just shrugged and carried on with their day. But the crown jewel of Ptolemy's mistakes was his giant southern continent. Because he believed the Indian Ocean was enclosed, he imagined a landmass stretching across the southern hemisphere to balance the weight of the known continents. This phantom land haunted maps for centuries, eventually morphing into the mythical Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Explorers would spend generations trying to find it, convinced it had to exist. When Europeans finally stumbled across Australia, they thought, "Ah, there it is." Spoiler, it wasn't what Ptolemy had drawn. But hey, close enough. The brilliance, and the problem, with Ptolemy's maps was that they were systematic. Once his Geographia was translated and spread, mapmakers had a framework. They could plot cities, coastlines, and rivers using coordinates. They could draw the world with mathematical precision. Unfortunately, the precision often just made the errors look more official. So tonight, picture Ptolemy at his desk, his hunched over, quill in hand, carefully plotting coordinates onto a grid. He stretches the Mediterranean a little too far. He sketches India as an oversized blob. He encloses the Indian Ocean with a sweeping line of imaginary land. Then he leans back, satisfied. To him, it looks complete. A world, contained on parchment. It's wrong, yes. But it's also beautiful. For the first time, the world feels like something you can hold in your hands. And for more than 1,000 years, that illusion would endure. So, Rome collapses in the west, libraries burn, and Europe enters its centuries-long let's just not read phase. But Ptolemy's Geographia doesn't vanish. Instead, it takes a detour. The scrolls are translated into Arabic, and suddenly they find new life in the hands of scholars from Baghdad to Cordoba. While monks in Europe were drawing Jerusalem in the center of the world and leaving the edges to imagination, scholars in the Islamic world were busy checking coordinates, revising coastlines, and adding new data from travelers who actually went places. The big turning point came in the 9th century, when Ptolemy's Geographia was translated into Arabic. Scholars in the Abbasid Caliphate, especially in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, devoured it. The House of Wisdom was basically a super library and research center where scholars translated Greek texts, studied astronomy, math, and medicine, and argued endlessly about everything. It was the sort of place Ptolemy would have loved. Lots of scrolls, lots of coffee, well, eventually, and endless debates over coastlines. But these scholars weren't just copy-pasting. They tested Ptolemy's work. They sent travelers and geographers farther east and south than the Greeks or Romans had ever gone. They incorporated Indian and Persian knowledge. They wrote new atlases, correcting the length of the Mediterranean, shifting the shape of Asia, and slowly erasing some of Ptolemy's biggest blunders. One of the great names here is Al-Khwarizm, a mathematician who also dabbled in geography. In the 9th century, he compiled a revised version of Ptolemy's coordinates, fixing some of the more outrageous distortions. He's better remembered today for giving us algebra and the word algorithm, but his maps were a quiet revolution too. Imagine updating someone else's bad Google Maps directions and making them slightly less terrible. That was Al-Khwarizm with Ptolemy. Then there was Al-Idrisi, a 12th century geographer working in Sicily, under the Norman king Roger II. Yes, you heard that right, an Arab geographer employed by a Christian king in southern Italy. Medieval politics were weird like that. Al-Idrisi produced the Tabula Rogeriana, one of the most detailed medieval maps of the world. It showed Europe, Asia, and Africa with surprising accuracy. He had clearly read Ptolemy, but he had also spoken to merchants, sailors, and travelers, blending theory with actual observation. His map famously has south at the top, which can feel disorienting today. But orientation was arbitrary back then. People flipped maps however they liked. North at the top only became standard much later, mostly because Europeans decided it should be. Al-Idrisi's South-Up world is a reminder that even the default direction is just tradition. Meanwhile, in Cordoba, scholars of Al-Andalus absorbed Ptolemaic geography through Arabic translations. Spain under Muslim rule became another center of map-making. Astronomers refined star charts, geographers described rivers and trade routes, and libraries filled with atlases. All of it was steeped in Ptolemy's coordinate system, but constantly tested against real-world reports. The result? By the High Middle Ages, the Islamic world had maps that were far superior to anything Europe was producing. Their maps showed Africa wrapping further south, India drawn more realistically, and trade routes stretching into China. Baghdad and Cairo felt closer to the actual shape of the world than London or Paris did. And while Europe lagged, its scholars eventually peeked over the fence. Latin translations of Arabic versions of Ptolemy trickled back into Europe by the 12th and 13th centuries. Imagine a monk staring at one of these imported atlases, realizing with some horror that the world was bigger and more complex than he thought. Ptolemy's ghost was returning, but with a makeover courtesy of Arabic mathematicians. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the irony. Europeans later congratulated themselves on rediscovering Ptolemy during the Renaissance, but in reality, they only had him because Islamic scholars had kept the flame alive, polished the coordinates, and passed them back. Without Baghdad and Cordoba, Ptolemy's scrolls might have crumbled into dust. The Renaissance rediscovery was really a hand-me-down. And the Islamic maps had their quirks too. They weren't just scientific documents, they were often decorated, filled with artistry. Coastlines curled elegantly, mountains rose like little triangles, rivers wound like ribbons. Maps were less about perfect scale and more about blending data with beauty. Ptolemy's grids were still there in the background, but they were overlaid with flowing artistry that made the world feel alive. So tonight, picture a scholar in Baghdad, seated in a cool courtyard, scrolls spread around him. He's copying Ptolemy's coordinates, correcting them, plotting rivers he's never seen, guided by reports from merchants who've trudged across deserts or sailed through monsoons. His ink flows, the grid takes shape, and the world grows slightly less distorted. In the margins, he sketches a few decorative flourishes, not sea monsters, but calligraphic swirls. The result isn't perfect, but it's a little closer to reality than the squashed pancake Ptolemy had left behind. Ptolemy's system lived on because these scholars kept it alive, correcting, adapting, transmitting it forward. And in doing so, they made sure that when Europe was finally ready to draw the world again, they had more than dog-headed people and dragons to go on. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was finally stretching itself awake after its long medieval nap. Printing presses started spitting out books, universities popped up, and scholars dusted off Greek and Latin texts like they were thrift store finds suddenly back in fashion. Among these treasures was Ptolemy's Geographia. After centuries of being tucked away in Arabic translation, then trickling back into Europe, it hit the big time in the 15th century when it was printed in Latin with shiny new maps. Suddenly, Ptolemy wasn't just a name whispered in monastery scriptoria, he was a Renaissance bestseller. Everyone from scholars to merchants wanted a copy. And this is where things got both impressive and hilariously wrong. On one hand, the Renaissance loved Ptolemy because he offered a systematic, mathematical way to draw the world. At a time when European maps were still often circular TO maps, Jerusalem in the middle, Asia on top, Europe bottom left, Africa bottom right, all surrounded by ocean, Ptolemy's grid system looked dazzlingly modern. You could see coastlines, latitudes, longitudes. You could imagine sailing beyond the horizon with math to guide you, instead of divine guesswork. On the other hand, his data was still centuries out of date. Asia was bloated, Africa squashed, the Indian Ocean closed off, and that mysterious southern continent still sprawled across the bottom. But the Renaissance, enamored with anything ancient, treated his word as gospel. Better a wrong map with Greek credentials than a blank page. Take Columbus. When he planned his westward voyage, he relied heavily on Ptolemy's inflated Asia. According to Ptolemy, Asia stretched much farther east than it really does, which meant that Columbus could convince himself that sailing west from Spain would land him in Asia after a manageable ocean hop. He wasn't just being bold. He was being bold with a bad map. And when he stumbled across the Caribbean instead, he thought he'd reached islands off Asia. Ptolemy's ghost was there in the rigging, whispering, "Close enough." The early printed editions of the Geographia also added new flourishes. Renaissance artists couldn't resist decorating the margins. Suddenly Ptolemy's sober coordinates were surrounded by wind gods blowing from the edges, little puffs of cheeks symbolizing breezes. Seas were filled with ships and sea monsters, because apparently no map was complete without at least one giant fish nibbling at a boat. The scientific framework was there, but the artistic flair made the maps look half reference book, half fairy tale. One of the quirks of these Ptolemaic maps is how they presented the terra incognita, the unknown lands. Instead of leaving blank space, cartographers often filled it with the imaginary. Great continents sprawled across the south, jungles filled with exotic animals dotted Africa, and Asia bulged with cities no European had ever seen. The logic was simple: better to invent something plausible than admit you didn't know. Which, to be fair, is still how most people handle awkward questions at dinner parties. And yet, despite the errors, Ptolemy was revolutionary for the Renaissance. His maps encouraged explorers. They gave structure to voyages. They created a sense of the world as finite, measurable, graspable. Even if the measurements were off, the psychological impact was real. Suddenly, the world wasn't infinite mystery. It was a grid waiting to be filled. This grid also influenced the rise of atlases. In the 16th century, publishers began producing map collections modeled on Ptolemy's system, but updated with new discoveries. So you'd get a familiar, Ptolemaic-looking world with little add-ons. Here's a new island Portugal just claimed. Here's a slightly less wrong version of Africa, and so on. The framework endured, even as explorers slowly exposed its flaws. And then there's the delicious irony. Every new discovery made Ptolemy's maps look worse. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa proved the Indian Ocean was open, not enclosed. Magellan's circumnavigation showed Asia wasn't conveniently close to Europe across the Atlantic. Cartographers had to redraw coastlines, delete imaginary continents, and sheepishly admit that the ancient master hadn't nailed it after all. But did that stop them from revering Ptolemy? Not really. He remained a kind of cartographic grandfather, wrong about specifics, but still credited with giving geography its skeleton. Even when explorers were busy proving him wrong, they were still using his grid lines to make their new maps. So tonight, picture a 15th century scholar in Florence, unrolling a freshly printed edition of Ptolemy's Geographia. He smooths the page, admires the neat grids, traces a finger along the bloated coast of Asia. In his mind, the world feels ordered, rational, within reach. Outside, merchants talk of strange islands across the sea, sailors boast of new routes, explorers prepare ships. Ptolemy's maps are about to mislead them and inspire them at the same time. Because sometimes, being wrong in detail is still right in spirit. Ptolemy didn't give them accuracy. He gave them the courage to imagine the world as a whole. By the 16th century, the cracks in Ptolemy's world were showing. Explorers rounded Africa, crossed the Pacific, bumped into continents he never knew existed. Mapmakers had to keep erasing his southern continent, stretching his Asia back into proportion, and opening up the Indian Ocean. Slowly, Ptolemy's confident grids began to look more like a patchwork quilt, parts still useful, parts embarrassingly wrong. And yet, his influence lingered. Even when the details failed, the framework survived. Latitude and longitude grids became standard. The idea that the world could be mathematically described, even if the math was off, stuck. Ptolemy had given people a way to think about geography as numbers, not just stories. That shift mattered far more than whether Taprobane was 10 times too big. By the early modern era, globes appeared. Atlases became fashionable coffee table books for the wealthy, or at least, their 16th century equivalent. And in each of them, you could still see Ptolemy's fingerprints. The grids, the structure, the sense that the Earth could be wrapped up neatly in lines and coordinates. Even into the Age of Enlightenment, when explorers had filled in most coastlines, Ptolemy was still cited, studied, argued with. His mistakes became teaching tools. His grids became permanent fixtures. The irony is that the man who had been wrong about so much ended up shaping how everyone approached being right. And then, in a way, he never left. Open Google Maps today and zoom out far enough, and what do you see? A grid of latitude and longitude wrapping the globe. The same skeleton Ptolemy proposed in Alexandria 1,800 years ago. Yes, it's refined, corrected, powered by satellites instead of sailors' gossip, but the bones are the same. Ptolemy would squint at your phone, mutter something about nice portable parchment, and probably be both horrified and proud. But maybe the most human part of Ptolemy's story isn't the math. It's the mistakes. The way people clung to his bloated Asia, his oversized Taprobane, his imaginary southern continent. It reminds us that history isn't a straight line of progress. It's people making the best guesses they can, writing them down with enormous confidence, and then passing them along for centuries before someone finally checks. And honestly, there's a kind of poetry in that. To draw a world you haven't seen, to insist it makes sense, to fill in the blanks with certainty, it's both arrogant and strangely hopeful. Ptolemy's maps were wrong, but they were wrong beautifully. So tonight, let's picture him one last time. Alexandria, 2nd century. The harbor outside is full of ships, sailors shouting in languages Ptolemy doesn't understand. Inside, in a quiet study, he bends over a scroll. He sketches coastlines he's never walked, rivers he's never crossed, continents he can only imagine. He stretches the sea, fattens Asia, closes the Indian Ocean with a line of land. Then he leans back, satisfied. The world is drawn. Centuries later, monks, scholars, explorers, and printers will copy his mistakes, follow his grids, dream his dream. His wrong maps will guide ships across oceans, inspire voyages, and quietly undergird the way we still draw the earth. Because sometimes, history is less about being right, and more about daring to draw the line at all. But elsewhere, the path wasn't about walls or waterways, it was about climbing. Slowly, up into the Andes, where the air thins, the clouds settle, and the mountains rise like jagged green teeth. And tucked among those peaks, perched in silence, sits Machu Picchu, a city above the clouds. A stone labyrinth on a ridge, wrapped in mist, echoing only with the calls of birds and the rustle of wind. If you've ever seen a photo, you know the view. Terraces cut into the mountain, walls of grey stone fitted so tightly you can't slip a knife blade between them, all of it crowned by Huayna Picchu, the Sugarloaf Mountain looming like a stern guardian. But we're not here for the postcard version. No dramatic reveals, no lost city cliches. Tonight, we're here for the quiet Machu Picchu, the city not of tourists and drones, but of stones and silence. The place where Inca builders once lived, worked, prayed, and probably complained endlessly about hauling giant rocks up impossible slopes. So, dim the lights. Settle in. Imagine the mountain air cool on your skin, the mist curling around the stones, and the sound of your own footsteps crunching softly on ancient terraces. Tonight we'll wander Machu Picchu the slow way, stone by stone, story by story, until it all fades back into the clouds. The first thing to remember is, nobody really knows why Machu Picchu exists. It wasn't the Inca capital, that was Cusco, far down the valley. It wasn't a fortress, though it looks dramatic enough. It wasn't big enough to be a full city. So what was it? Some think it was a royal retreat, built by the Inca Emperor Pachacuti in the 15th century. Because apparently when you're emperor of the largest empire in the Americas, a palace in Cusco just isn't enough. Why not add a vacation home perched on a cliff, accessible only by steep trails and llamas with bad attitudes? Others suggest it was a religious site, a sacred place aligned with mountains and stars, where priests mumbled prayers to the sun while carefully not tumbling off the edge. And maybe it was both. A royal resort with a strong side of cosmic spirituality. Either way, what matters is that it was built. And once you really think about where it was built, the whole project feels a little unhinged. Imagine looking at a jagged ridge, thousands of feet above a roaring river, covered in jungle, and saying, yes, perfect spot for my estate. Let's start hauling the granite. The audacity is impressive. Or insane. Often both. The Inca builders carved terraces into the slopes, creating steps of farmland that still hug the mountain like green stripes. They laid out temples, palaces, plazas, and fountains. They carved and polished stones so precisely that 5 centuries later, the walls still stand, unmortared, defiant against earthquakes. Meanwhile, half the houses in modern cities crumble if you look at them too hard. But the genius wasn't just the stones, it was the setting. Machu Picchu wasn't built despite the mountains. It was built with them. The Inca treated the peaks as sacred, as living beings. The city seems to flow with the ridge itself, blending into the landscape instead of conquering it. Like the mountains whispered where to place every terrace and wall. Now, of course, the ruins we see today are silent. No voices, no music, no fires in the hearths. Just llamas chewing lazily on the grass while tourists huff and puff their way up the steps. But once, this place was alive. Priests lit incense to Inti, the sun god. Farmers tended crops on the terraces. Servants carried water in clay jars. Children chased each other along the stone paths, while high in the temple, nobles muttered about omens and offerings. Imagine standing in the central plaza 500 years ago. The stone walls gleaming, thatched roofs intact, smoke curling up into the crisp air. The sound of flutes and drums drifting from a ritual. The laughter of workers who'd finally finished another impossible stone wall. Life in motion, in a place that now feels frozen in time. And yet, even then, Machu Picchu must have felt remote. Cusco bustled with thousands. Machu Picchu housed maybe a few hundred at most. It wasn't the empire's heart, it was a retreat, a ritual site, a statement in stone that the Inca could bend mountains to their will. And when the empire fell, Machu Picchu was abandoned, swallowed by jungle, left to the clouds and the condors. But tonight, we're not racing ahead to the fall. We're just standing here, in the mist, listening. The stones are silent, yes, but they remember. Footsteps, prayers, laughter, complaints about hauling rocks. The city above the clouds still murmurs, if you listen carefully enough. So, we're standing in Machu Picchu. The stones are fitted, the terraces are green, and the mist curls lazily around the peaks. It looks empty now. Just llamas grazing, tourists wheezing, and the occasional guide shouting this way, please. But 5 centuries ago, this was a living community. Not a massive city buzzing with thousands, but a small, carefully chosen population. Maybe a few hundred people at most. Let's imagine them. First, the farmers. Because as romantic as Machu Picchu looks now, no city lives on aesthetics alone. Someone had to grow the food. The terraces, carved into the mountainside, weren't just pretty landscaping. They were engineered agriculture. Layers of stone, gravel, soil, and sand created drainage systems that kept the fields fertile and stopped the whole thing from collapsing into the valley below. Honestly, better drainage than most modern suburbs. On those terraces, workers planted maize, potatoes, and quinoa. Yes, quinoa, the trendy superfood on your Instagram salad bowl, was standard Andean fare centuries before it became overpriced in health food stores. Farmers dug carefully with their wooden tools, squinting against the mountain sun, probably complaining about how thin the soil was and how steep the slope. Farming on a cliff is not for the faint of heart. Then there were the llamas. You can't picture Inca life without them. They weren't just cute animals for tourist photos, they were pack carriers, wool suppliers, and, occasionally, dinner. Llamas carried loads of firewood, crops, and supplies up the treacherous paths to Machu Picchu. They also spit at anyone who annoyed them. Which, frankly, is a reasonable defense mechanism when you're forced to haul bags of potatoes up mountainsides for a living. Imagine a line of llamas clambering up the trail, bells jingling around their necks, drivers shouting encouragement. The animals panting, the men swatting away flies, all just to deliver enough maize for the emperor's picnic. Logistics in the clouds. Speaking of emperors, Machu Picchu probably wasn't full of them. It wasn't a permanent royal residence, it was more like a high-altitude resort. Pachacuti, the great Inca emperor who supposedly commissioned it, might have visited occasionally, bringing along his entourage. Picture him arriving with nobles, priests, and servants in tow, puffing slightly in the thin air but refusing to admit it. After all, if you're the emperor of the Andes, you can't exactly wheeze your way into your own vacation home. When the emperor wasn't around, the population was a mix of caretakers, priests, artisans, and workers. They kept the terraces productive, the temples in order, and the fountains flowing. They lived in small, thatched roof houses clustered along the pathways. Stone walls, narrow doorways, simple hearths. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was steady. And let's not forget the priests. Religion infused everything in Inca life, and Machu Picchu, with its temples and sacred stones, was drenched in ritual. Priests tended fires, prepared offerings, studied omens. They probably spent a lot of time staring at the sun, the stars, and the mountains, muttering about what they meant. Imagine a priest in long robes, standing at the temple of the sun at dawn. The first light slices over the ridge, hitting the stone exactly as intended, and the priest nods sagely as if to say, "See? We planned that." Which is impressive, considering they had no metal tools, no wheels, and yet managed cosmic-level architecture. Daily rhythms were tied to the seasons. Planting, harvesting, festivals, fires lit at night, meals shared in courtyards, children chasing each other down the stone paths, tripping, skinning knees, and getting scolded for playing too close to the terrace edges. Imagine the panic of a mother yelling, "Get back from the ledge," while balancing a clay pot on her hip. Parenting challenges remain the same, even at 8,000 feet. Meals weren't glamorous, but they worked. Potatoes in dozens of varieties, boiled, roasted, dried, mashed. Maize, ground into flour for flatbreads or brewed into chicha, a fermented corn beer that was the Andean equivalent of after-work relaxation. Quinoa stews with herbs. Guinea pigs roasted for special occasions. Yes, the cute squeaky pets, except on a plate. Life was practical. The menu was less Michelin star, more survival with flair. Artisans gave Machu Picchu its beauty. Stoneworkers fitted blocks so precise you still can't slide paper between them. Potters shaped jars and bowls for cooking and storage. Weavers produced textiles from llama and alpaca wool, dyed in bright colors. Textiles were a mark of wealth and prestige. Your clothing showed your rank. A fine tunic was as much a power symbol as a palace. Picture a group of women sitting in the courtyard, weaving on backstrap looms, chatting idly while threads of red, yellow, and black grew into intricate patterns. Children toddling nearby, priests shuffling past, the sound of a flute from a distant house. Mundane, ordinary, and yet on top of a mountain. Water flowed through the city thanks to ingenious stone channels. Springs higher on the mountain were diverted into fountains and baths. The water burbled constantly, clean and cold, sustaining life on the ridge. Imagine filling a clay jar, splashing your face, and marveling that someone designed plumbing this reliable centuries before modern pipes. Then muttering because it was still freezing cold. Of course, work never ended. Walls needed repairs. Crops needed tending. Fires had to be kept burning. Servants scurried, priests muttered, farmers sweated. But there were also moments of quiet. Families sitting together at dusk, sharing a simple meal as the mountains glowed in sunset colors. Priests watching the stars appear one by one, tracing constellations that told stories. Musicians playing wooden flutes or panpipes, their notes echoing through the valleys. Life in Machu Picchu wasn't grand battles or dramatic events. It was the slow, steady rhythm of survival, ritual, and community, all balanced precariously on a mountaintop. And through it all, the stones stood silent. Walls fitted with impossible precision. Terraces green with crops. Temples aligned with stars. People came and went, worked and prayed, laughed and argued. But the stones remained. Watching. Waiting. So let's pause here. Picture yourself sitting on one of those terraces at twilight. The mist rises, the valley falls silent, and the city hums with small sounds. The crackle of a fire, the splash of water in a fountain, the laughter of children, the low notes of a flute. Ordinary life, perched above the clouds. So far, we've seen the terraces green with potatoes, the priests muttering at sunrise, and the farmers trying not to fall off cliffs. But Machu Picchu wasn't just any mountain village. It had imperial fingerprints all over it. And those fingerprints belonged to the Inca emperors, men who considered themselves children of the sun, and behaved accordingly. Which is to say, with equal parts grandeur and hardness. The emperor most often linked with Machu Picchu is Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. His name means something like Earthshaker, which feels appropriately dramatic for someone who decided, you know what would look good here? A luxury stone estate perched on a mountaintop. Pachacuti reigned in the mid-15th century, and under him, the Inca Empire exploded in size. Before him, the Incas were just another Andean kingdom. After him, they were running the biggest empire in the Americas. And what does every successful conqueror need? A summer getaway, apparently. It's believed Pachacuti commissioned Machu Picchu as a royal estate, a place to retreat from Cusco, to host nobles, to sacrifice a few llamas in peace, and to remind everyone that he could put a palace literally anywhere. Now, Pachacuti wasn't alone in his quirks. Inca rulers in general lived in a world halfway between human and divine. They were sons of the sun, chosen by Inti, the great solar deity, which gave them enormous prestige, but also some fairly exhausting responsibilities. For instance, their bodies were sacred even after death. Literally, when an emperor died, he wasn't just buried and remembered fondly. His mummy was preserved, dressed, and kept in Cusco. These royal mummies were paraded at festivals, consulted on political matters, and occasionally fed offerings of food and drink. Imagine being the new emperor and having to share power with your dead dad, who was still technically attending council meetings, just in a slightly less animated form. And inheritance. A nightmare. Each new emperor had to build his own estate because his predecessors' lands and palaces went to the dead emperor's mummy cult. Yes, you heard that right. The dead emperor kept his property, his staff, his fields, and his wealth, all managed by his descendants. The new ruler had to start from scratch. Which explains why Inca emperors were so eager to carve new estates into mountainsides. Building Machu Picchu wasn't extravagance, it was necessity, with a touch of cosmic family drama. The royal family itself was a bit tangled. Incas practiced what modern historians call sibling marriage. Basically, emperors often married their sisters. The idea was to keep the divine bloodline pure, which, of course, is exactly what every dynasty from Egypt to the Habsburgs has told themselves right before things got weird. The Inca took it in stride. An emperor could have many wives and concubines, but the main wife, often his sister, was the Koya, the queen, considered his divine partner. Picture family dinners. Half the table are siblings, half are cousins, and everyone's trying not to think too hard about it. A genealogical nightmare, but politically useful. And then there was the sheer scale of their entourages. When an emperor traveled, it wasn't a quiet affair. He moved with thousands of attendants, guards, priests, servants, cooks, and workers. Roads were cleared, llamas loaded, villages mobilized to feed the procession. If Pachacuti really did visit Machu Picchu, the entire ridge would have erupted in activity. Fires blazing, terraces bursting with food, servants running, priests chanting, nobles lounging dramatically. All for one man's holiday. But the emperors weren't all grandeur. They had their quirks, their habits, their fragile humanity hidden beneath the divine titles. Some accounts describe them as deeply ritualistic, obsessing over omens and sacrifices. Others note their elaborate feasts, where drinking chicha corn beer seemed less like refreshment and more like a competitive sport. And of course, every emperor had to balance between projecting divine authority and quietly managing squabbles within the nobility. Imagine Pachacuti after a long day of empire building. Sitting in a finely woven tunic, sipping chicha, listening to priests drone on about omens, and thinking, honestly, I just wanted to enjoy the view from the terrace without another debate about which star means rain. Machu Picchu itself was probably filled with reminders of royal presence. The finest temples and houses were reserved for nobles. Stone walls polished smooth. Doorways shaped with elegant trapezoids. Gardens cultivated with exotic plants carried up from lower valleys. Even the llamas grazing the terraces may have been carefully chosen herds, tended for ritual purposes. And yet, for all its grandeur, the emperor's life here must have felt oddly quiet. A mountain estate where the most dramatic event was sunrise, and the loudest sound was wind rustling through thatch. Compared to the bustling heart of Cusco, Machu Picchu was serene, almost lonely. Perhaps that was the point. But let's not give the rulers too much credit. For the workers who actually built Machu Picchu, royal estates were back-breaking labor. Huge stones carved, hauled, and fitted into place with astonishing precision, without wheels, iron tools, or draft animals. Just human muscle, clever engineering, and a lot of patience. It's easy to romanticize the emperor's vision when you're not the one dragging a 10-ton boulder up a mountain. So while Pachacuti may have strolled the terraces feeling divine, somewhere nearby a worker was muttering, all this for his vacation house. Still, the emperors left their mark. Machu Picchu wasn't just stone and terraces. It was dynasty carved into rock. A silent reminder that the Incas weren't just farmers and priests, they were rulers who reshaped landscapes to fit their vision. And when the empire collapsed under Spanish conquest, the royal estates crumbled. Cusco was taken, mummies burned, rituals banned. But Machu Picchu, remote and hidden, survived in silence. The stones endured, long after the emperors' names faded into legend. So tonight, as we picture the citadel, let's imagine the emperors who once claimed it. Pachacuti, the earth shaker, gazing proudly over the mountains. Priests bustling around him, nobles whispering, servants scurrying. And behind it all, the silent stones, patient and eternal, watching dynasties rise and fall. The rulers are gone. The mummies are dust. But the stones remain. Quiet, stubborn, and oddly soothing. We've talked about the people, the rulers, and the rhythms of life. But at Machu Picchu, the real stars aren't the emperors or the priests. They are the stones. Those stubborn grey blocks, stacked so precisely that 5 centuries of rain, earthquakes, and tourists have barely nudged them. The stones of Machu Picchu are the reason it feels timeless. Silent, patient, and just a little obsessive. Let's start with the terraces. Because the first thing you see climbing up the ridge isn't temples or palaces, it's fields. Layer after layer of stone terraces hugging the mountain, like green stripes painted across the slope. They weren't just decoration. They were survival. Each terrace was engineered with layers of gravel, sand, and soil for perfect drainage. Rain soaked in, instead of washing the mountain away in one dramatic landslide. Imagine the labor. Stones hauled up, walls built, dirt carried basket by basket. Farmers bent double in the sun, planting potatoes and maize on what was basically a giant staircase. From a distance, it looked serene. Up close, it was endless back-breaking maintenance. A perfect example of Inca engineering. Practical, beautiful, and just slightly cruel to the people doing the work. Then there are the walls. The Inca stonework at Machu Picchu is almost suspiciously good. No mortar, no glue, just giant granite blocks carved and fitted so tightly that even modern razor blades can't slip between them. Earthquakes? No problem. The stones shifted gently and settled back into place, while European buildings of the same era would crumble like soggy bread at the first tremor. How did they do it? No one knows exactly. They didn't have wheels or iron tools. No draft animals to drag stones. Just manpower, ropes, levers, and an absurd level of patience. Some say they carved by pounding stone against stone. Others think they used sand and water to polish the surfaces smooth. However they did it, the result is eerie perfection. Walls that look almost machine-made, standing proudly in the clouds. Of course, not every wall was perfect. Some parts of Machu Picchu used rougher stonework, smaller rocks stacked quickly. Those were the servants' quarters, the storage rooms, the less glamorous corners of the city. It's architectural classism in stone. The emperor gets polished blocks, the workers get close enough. Walk through the ruins today and you can tell immediately where the nobles lived and where everyone else got stuffed. Then there are the temples. Machu Picchu wasn't just a royal retreat, it was also sacred ground. The Temple of the Sun is the most famous. A curved wall of finely cut stone, built around a natural rock outcrop. On certain days of the year, the sunrise lines up perfectly with its windows, flooding the chamber with light. Priests probably stood there at dawn, nodding sagely while muttering prayers to Inti, the sun god. Or maybe they were just relieved their math worked out and the sun hit the window as planned. Nearby is the Temple of the Three Windows, a wall with 3 large trapezoidal openings overlooking the sacred plaza. No one knows exactly what they meant, but scholars love to speculate. 3 windows for the 3 parts of the Inca world: sky, earth, and underworld. Or maybe 3 dynasties. Or maybe the builders just liked symmetry. Whatever the case, it's become one of the citadel's most iconic sights. Stone windows framing clouds, like postcards carved in granite. And then there's the Intihuatana stone, the so-called hitching post of the sun. A carved granite pillar sitting high in the complex. On certain days, shadows align with the stone in ways that suggest it functioned as a solar calendar. Priests probably used it to track solstices and equinoxes. Tour guides loved to claim it held the sun in place. Which sounds poetic, though more likely it was an oversized astronomical calculator. Still, it's hard not to admire a civilization that built literal timepieces out of mountain rock. Water management was another quiet marvel. Springs higher on the ridge were channeled through stone aqueducts into fountains. The fountains stepped gently down through the city, one pouring into the next. A natural soundtrack of burbling water, perfectly engineered centuries before modern plumbing. Imagine rinsing your hands in a fountain carved from granite, cool mountain water flowing endlessly past, while you mutter about yet another day of terrace weeding. And of course, there were the houses. Most of them simple, stone walls, thatched roofs, 1 or 2 rooms. Fire pits for cooking, niches in the walls for storing goods. No gold, no murals, just practicality. And yet, even here, the stonework is sturdy. 500 years later, the walls still stand, though the thatched roofs are long gone. Walking among them today feels eerie, like stepping into a neighborhood where everyone just left, but the houses stayed waiting. What makes Machu Picchu's architecture so striking is how it blends with the landscape. The city doesn't dominate the mountain, it clings to it. The terraces curve with the ridge. The temples align with surrounding peaks. Natural rock outcrops are incorporated into walls and plazas, as if the builders wanted to merge human effort with the bones of the earth itself. To the Inca, mountains weren't just scenery. They were apis, sacred beings, spirits of stone. Building Machu Picchu wasn't conquering the mountains. It was conversing with them. Every wall, every terrace, every fountain whispered, "We belong here," in harmony with the peaks. And yet, the obsession with stone borders on comical. Some blocks are enormous, 10, 15 tons. There is no practical reason to haul stones that big up a mountainside except to prove you can. It's architectural flexing. A silent competition between emperors and the mountains themselves. Look at me, I made the cliff into a palace. Meanwhile, the workers dragging the stones probably muttered, "Great, another boulder. Just what we needed." Today, the stones are silent. Tourists wander between them, snapping photos, whispering about mysteries. But if you sit quietly, you can almost hear the echoes of their builders. The scrape of tools, the grunt of effort, the shouted instructions of a foreman who probably had a sore throat by the end of the day. And yet, for all the labor, the stones endure. Earthquakes have shaken them, storms have lashed them, vines have tried to swallow them. But the walls remain. Patient, silent, eternal. As if the city itself has settled into a kind of timeless meditation. So let's pause here. Imagine yourself sitting in the sacred plaza, surrounded by temples. The stones glow faintly in the afternoon sun. Clouds drift across the valley, brushing the peaks. Water murmurs from the fountains nearby. The air is cool, thin, and hushed. You run your hand across a stone wall, smooth and solid, and realize it's been here longer than memory. And it will likely be here long after you're gone. Machu Picchu stones are more than architecture. They're silence, captured in granite. And they whisper the patience of centuries. So far, we've looked at Machu Picchu as stone and terraces, walls and waterworks. But to the Incas, those weren't just practical structures. They were sacred. Almost everything here was soaked in ritual, layered with symbolism, aligned with gods, stars, and mountains. Which means if you lived here, you didn't just farm potatoes or polish stones. You lived inside a cosmic map. The Inca worldview was, to put it mildly, elaborate. They divided existence into 3 realms: Hanan Pasha, the upper world of gods and stars; K Pasha, the middle world of humans and animals; and Uku Pasha, the underworld of ancestors and spirits. It wasn't heaven, earth, and hell exactly, but a layered universe where everything was connected. And right in the middle of it all was the sun god, Inti. Inti wasn't just a distant deity, he was the empire's father. The Inca emperor claimed descent from the sun, which is a bold family claim, but it worked. Every ritual, every festival, every temple whispered back to Inti. At Machu Picchu, the most obvious reminder is the Temple of the Sun. That curved wall of stone, catching the first light of dawn on solstices. Priests stood there at sunrise, muttering prayers, burning offerings of coca leaves and chicha beer. Incense drifted into the cold air, flames flickered, and the sun itself lit the temple like a spotlight. An annual performance, part science, part faith, part cosmic reassurance that yes, the sun would rise again. But Machu Picchu wasn't just a solar stage. The mountains themselves were sacred. The Incas called them apis, spirits, lords of stone, protectors of valleys. Build a city here, and you weren't just choosing a nice view. You were surrounding yourself with living guardians. Huayna Picchu loomed above, sacred as a watchtower. Other peaks framed the horizon like a council of stone giants. Priests made offerings to them, pouring libations, burying food, whispering prayers. Imagine standing in the central plaza as the mist clears. Mountains rise all around, their slopes striped with terraces. To us, they are scenery. To the Incas, they were gods, watching, listening, judging silently. Suddenly, the stonework feels less like architecture and more like devotion in granite. The Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, was another cosmic anchor. Carved into a high platform, it aligned with solstices and equinoxes. On the right day, shadows cast by its angles pointed directly to surrounding peaks or the cardinal directions. Priests probably gathered here, tracking time, praying, and tying rituals to the cycles of the heavens. It's easy to dismiss as superstition, but it was also science. The Incas used astronomy to guide agriculture. Knowing when rains would come, when to plant, when to harvest, it was survival wrapped in ceremony. The line between ritual and practicality blurred. If the priest said the sun was pleased, it also meant your potato crop was on schedule. Two blessings in one. Offerings were everywhere. The Incas believed reciprocity kept the universe balanced. You gave gifts to gods and spirits, and they kept the world turning. At Machu Picchu, priests buried coca leaves, maize, and tiny llama figurines carved from stone. On rare occasions, actual llamas were sacrificed. And in especially solemn rituals, yes, sometimes children were chosen as offerings on sacred mountains. A disturbing practice, but framed in Inca belief as an honor, children given to the gods to ensure cosmic balance. Before you panic, there's no evidence Machu Picchu itself hosted the more extreme sacrifices. It was more a place of prayer, offerings, and festivals. Imagine groups gathered in the plaza, singing hymns, drums, and flutes echoing against the mountains, smoke rising from fires, food shared in ritual meals. Sacred, yes, but also communal. Religion wasn't abstract, it was woven into daily life. And speaking of daily life, spirituality wasn't just for priests. Every family had household rituals. Hearth fires blessed each morning. Small offerings of food and drink to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, before meals. Farmers leaving coca leaves at terrace walls, asking the soil for good harvests. It was a spirituality of constant gestures, little acts of gratitude sprinkled across the day. At Machu Picchu, surrounded by mountains and sky, those gestures must have felt amplified. Light spilling across temple stones, clouds curling around peaks, rivers roaring in the valley below. Nature itself seemed alive, so of course it demanded reverence. Festivals punctuated the year. The grandest, Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, was held in Cusco, but echoes surely reached Machu Picchu. Days of dances, feasts, and ceremonies. Priests chanting. Nobles drinking chicha until ritual enthusiasm blurred into hangover. Fire lit in golden vessels. Everything choreographed to honor Inti and reassure the people that cosmic order remained intact. At Machu Picchu, a smaller version would have unfolded. Priests at the Temple of the Sun food prepared in great quantities. Maize beer, roasted potatoes, guinea pig sizzling. Music filling the terraces, dancers weaving in bright textiles. A sacred feast, perched among the clouds. The rituals may sound elaborate, but at their heart they were about reassurance. Life in the Andes was precarious. Crops could fail, frost could strike, rains could vanish. Mountains were majestic, but also dangerous. By offering to gods and spirits, the Incas believed they were nudging the universe toward balance. The rituals said, "We respect you, please don't kill us with another bad harvest." Practical faith. dressed in smoke and music. Walking Machu Picchu today, it's easy to see only ruins. Empty temples, roofless houses, silent stones. But if you stop and listen, you can almost imagine the ceremonies. The low hum of chants, the steady beat of drums, the smell of incense and roasted maize, priests raising hands to the rising sun, families bowing heads, offering food to the earth. A city alive not with chatter, but with prayer. So let's pause here. Picture the temple of the sun at dawn. Light slices through the window, striking the altar. Priests bow, smoke curls upward, bells on llama harnesses jingle faintly. The air is cold, the mountains silent, the city hushed in reverence. For one moment, the sun itself seems caught by stone. That was Machu Picchu. Not just terraces and walls, but a sanctuary where heaven and earth met in rituals, prayers, and offerings. A city above the clouds, whispering to the gods. So far, Machu Picchu has been alive with priests, terraces, rituals, and royal picnics in the clouds. But of course, history doesn't leave perfection alone. Like so many great places, Machu Picchu eventually went quiet. Its stones stayed, but the people vanished. Roofs rotted, terraces overgrew, fountains silenced. The city dissolved into mist. And here's the strange part, no one really knows why. Some say Machu Picchu was abandoned during the Spanish conquest. Which would make sense, since the 16th century was basically the worst time to be an Inca emperor. Francisco Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors waltzed into Peru, captured the Emperor Atahualpa, and unraveled the empire with alarming speed. Temples were looted, cities burned, whole systems collapsed. But the Spanish never mentioned Machu Picchu. Not once. Which suggests they may never have found it. The site was remote, tucked into mountains, surrounded by jungle. And honestly, the conquistadors were busy plundering Cusco, so maybe hiking up a ridge wasn't on their to-do list. So Machu Picchu slipped through unnoticed, spared the direct destruction that fell on other Inca sites. Others argue Machu Picchu was abandoned even earlier. Perhaps it was too remote, too difficult to sustain. Maybe the emperor's heirs had new estates closer to Cusco. Maybe famine or disease thinned its people. Or maybe it was always meant to be temporary, a summer retreat that outlived its purpose. Whatever the reason, by the late 1500s, the city was largely empty. The stones stayed, but the voices faded. And so, for centuries, Machu Picchu slept. Imagine it then. Roofs collapsing, straw turning to dust. Walls standing, but vines creeping slowly up. Terraces still holding, but wild grasses covering them. The fountains silenced, then clogged with earth. Birds nesting in the temples. Mist curling endlessly around deserted plazas. Only the mountains watching, patient as ever. For local Quechua communities, the ruins were never lost. They knew of them, even farmed the terraces at times. But to the outside world, Machu Picchu vanished into obscurity. Centuries passed. The empire that built it was gone. Spain's empire rose, then stumbled. And all the while, Machu Picchu sat above the clouds, quiet, waiting. Then came the rediscovery. And like most rediscoveries, it was less sudden revelation and more one person asked directions while locals shrugged and pointed up the hill. In 1911, an American historian and explorer named Hiram Bingham stumbled onto the site. He wasn't looking for Machu Picchu specifically. He thought he was searching for Vilcabamba, the last holdout of the Inca resistance. Armed with funding from Yale and the National Geographic Society, he marched through Peru asking about ruins. Local farmers guided him to the ridge. And there it was, Machu Picchu, half choked in jungle but still astonishing. Bingham was floored. He called it the lost city of the Incas, a phrase that stuck, even though it was inaccurate. Locals had always known about it, and it wasn't the last Inca city. But lost city sounds dramatic, so history textbooks ran with it. Cue the myth-making. Bingham hacked away vines, mapped the ruins, and promptly carted off artifacts, ceramics, tools, bones, back to Yale for study. Many of them stayed in American collections for decades, sparking long disputes over repatriation. It was classic early 20th century archaeology. part discovery, part colonial looting, all wrapped in breathless magazine articles. Still, his work put Machu Picchu on the global stage. Photos spread. Tourists began to dream. Scholars debated endlessly. Was it a fortress? A monastery? A royal estate? Every theory more dramatic than the last. People projected whatever story they liked onto the stones. And myths flourished. Some said it was a city of virgins, a secret convent for chosen women. Others claimed it was a fortress, a last stand hidden in the mountains. Still others insisted it was a cosmic observatory, a giant astronomical calendar carved into stone. In truth, it was probably all of these things a little, and none entirely. A royal estate, yes. A sacred sanctuary, yes. But not a single neat label. Machu Picchu resists definition. As the 20th century rolled on, the site became a symbol. For Peruvians, it was a proud reminder of Inca heritage. For tourists, it was exotic romance, a lost world adventure. For archaeologists, it was a puzzle of stones and meaning. And for the ruins themselves, probably exhausting. Honestly, imagine sitting quietly for 4 centuries, only to be overrun by professors, guides, and people insisting you're a spaceship landing pad. Yes, even that theory exists. And yet, despite all the hype, Machu Picchu kept its silence. The terraces still held, the walls still stood. The jungle pressed in, tourists pressed out, but the stones remained patient. They didn't explain themselves. They didn't confirm or deny the myths. They just endured, as they always had, with the mountains watching. So let's pause here, and picture Machu Picchu in its long sleep. Mist curling over empty walls. Birds nesting in niches once filled with offerings. Terraces sprouting wild grass. A city that had been alive with priests, emperors, farmers, and children, now reduced to silence. And then picture 1911. Hiram Bingham climbing through the brush, machete in hand, stumbling out onto a terrace and gasping. The ruins spread before him, half swallowed by vines, still magnificent, still standing. A city re-emerging from centuries of clouded sleep. For him, it was discovery. For the stones, it was just another sunrise. We've wandered through Machu Picchu as it was built, lived in, abandoned, and rediscovered. We've seen emperors strutting, priests praying, workers sweating, and llamas glaring. And now, at the end, all that remains are the stones. Silent, steady, waiting in the clouds. Because that's what ruins do. They outlast the noise. Think of all the voices that have echoed here. Farmers muttering about rocky soil. Priests chanting hymns to the sun. Children laughing, chasing each other too close to the terrace edges. Nobles boasting over chicha beer. Workers groaning under stones, swearing softly that this was definitely the last wall they'd ever build. All those voices rose, echoed, and faded. And the stones stayed. Then came centuries of silence. No chants, no harvests, no emperors. Just wind in the grass, birds in the temples, rain on the terraces. A city once alive, now just a quiet skeleton wrapped in cloud. And even after rediscovery, even after a century of tourists and archaeologists, the silence lingers. Machu Picchu feels less like a bustling attraction and more like a city humming softly to itself, patient, a little amused that humans keep trying to solve its mysteries. There's something soothing in that. A reminder that most human drama is temporary. Empires rise, collapse, and vanish into textbooks. Rulers strut, die, and become footnotes. Priests argue over omens, workers sweat over walls, and centuries later we can't even agree on why the city was built. But the stones? They endure. Machu Picchu whispers, your empires are brief, your struggles passing, your noise fleeting. But the earth holds longer rhythms. And maybe that's why it feels like a lullaby. Not the excitement of conquest, not the clash of armies, but the patience of stone. The mountains rising around it like eternal guardians. The mist drifting, hiding, and revealing in cycles. The city itself almost breathing with the clouds. Imagine lying back on a terrace at dusk. The sun sliding behind Huayna Picchu, painting the stones gold. The last light fading, shadows lengthening. The valley below turning dark. The air cooling. And above, the first stars appearing. The same constellations the priests once read as cosmic instructions. No noise. Just wind, water, stone, and sky. That's the Machu Picchu that remains. Not the tourist hotspot, not the lost city, not the flashy myth. But a place of silence. A place where human ambition met mountains, where rituals met sky, where life flourished briefly and then faded, leaving only stones. And there's comfort in that. Comfort in knowing that even our grandest projects become whispers. That our noise fades into silence, and silence becomes strangely beautiful. So tonight, as we end, picture the stones again. Silent, weathered, stubborn. They've stood through empires, storms, jungles, and rediscovery. They've watched centuries pass like drifting clouds. And now, they sit in the Andes, patient as ever, murmuring softly to the mountains. Let the silence settle. Let the stones whisper. Let the city above the clouds lull you into sleep. The silent stones of Machu Picchu. The city above the clouds. And now, just clouds.